Chapter 13 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. A woman intervenes. In the midst of the commotion that followed, and while Mrs. Saumarez, attended by the doctors, was being carried out of the court-room, Tansley, at Brent's elbow, drew in his breath with a sharp, sibilant sound that came near being a whistle. Brent turned from the withdrawing figures to look at him questioningly. "Well?" he said. "Queer!" muttered Tansley. "Why should she faint? I wonder " "What?" demanded Brent, as the solicitor paused. "I'm wondering if she and Wellesley know anything that they're keeping to themselves," said Tansley. "She was obviously nervous and frightened when she was in the box just now." "She's a nervous, highly strung woman so I should say from what bit I've seen of her," remarked Brent. "Excitable." "Well, he's cool enough," said Tansley, nodding towards the witness box. "Hasn't turned a hair. Meeking'll get nothing out of him." The barrister was again addressing himself to Wellesley, who, after one glance at Mrs. Saumarez as she fainted, had continued, erect and defiant, facing the court. "You heard Mrs. Saumarez's evidence just now, Dr. Wellesley?" asked Meeking quietly. "I did." "Was it correct?" "I am not going to discuss it." "Nor answer any questions arising out of it?" "I am not." "Perhaps you will answer some questions of mine. Was there any jealousy existing between you and the late John Wallingford, of which Mrs. Saumarez was the cause?" Wellesley hesitated, taking a full minute for evident consideration. "I will answer that to a certain extent," he replied at last. "At the time of his death, no. None." "Had there been previously?" "At one time, yes. It was over." "You and he were good friends?" "Absolutely. Both in private and public I mean in public affairs. I was in complete touch and sympathy with him as regards his public work. Now, Dr. Wellesley, I think that for your own sake you ought to give us some information on one or two points. Mrs. Saumarez said on oath that you asked her to marry you 2 or 3 times. She also said that the late Mayor asked her too. Now " Wellesley suddenly brought down his hand on the ledge of the witness box. "I have already told you, sir, that I am not going to discuss my affairs with Mrs. Saumarez, nor with the late Mayor in relation to Mrs. Saumarez," he exclaimed with some show of anger. "They are private and have nothing to do with this inquiry. I shall not answer any questions relating to them." "In that case, Dr. Wellesley, you will lay yourself open to whatever conclusions the jury chooses to make," said Meeking. "We have already heard Mrs. Saumarez say what she did say. But as you won't answer, I will pass to another matter. You have already told us that the evidence of your assistant, Dr. Carstairs, is correct as to your movements between 7:30 and 8:11, or rather, as to your absence from the surgery during those 19 minutes. You adhere to that?" "Certainly. Carstairs is quite correct." "Very well. What were you doing during that time 19 minutes?" "For the most part of the time in my drawing room." "What do you mean by most part of the time?" "Well, I should say 3 parts of it." "And the other part?" "Spent in letting a caller in and letting the caller out." "By your front door?" "No, by a side door a private door." "You took this caller to your drawing room?" "Yes." "For a private interview?" "Precisely." Meeking allowed a minute to elapse, during which he affected to look at his papers. Suddenly he turned full on his witness. "Who was the caller?" Wellesley drew his tall figure still more erect. "I refuse to say." "Why?" "Because I am not going to drag in the name of my caller. The business my caller came upon was of a very private and confidential nature, and I am not going to break my rule of professional silence. I shall not give the name." Meeking again paused. Finally, with a glance at the Coroner, he turned to his witness and began to speak more earnestly. "Let me put this to you," he said. "Consider calmly, if you please, what we have heard already from previous witnesses, and what you yourself have admitted. Mrs. Saumarez has sworn that you and the late Mayor were rivals for her hand, and that there was jealousy between you. You admit that Mrs. Marriner is correct in identifying the burnt and blood-stained fragment of handkerchief found in the Mayor's Parlour after the murder as your property. You also acknowledge the existence of a door communicating between your house and the Moot Hall. You further admit that you were away from your surgery for 19 minutes at the very time the murder was committed, according to medical evidence, and that you were in your drawing-room from an inner room of which the door I have just referred to opens. Now, I suggest to you, Dr. Wellesley, that you should give us the name of the person who was with you in your drawing-room?" Wellesley, who during this exordium had steadily watched his questioner, shook his head more decidedly than before. "No," he answered promptly. "I shall not say who my caller was." Meeking spread out his hands in a gesture of helplessness. He turned to the Coroner, who for the last few minutes had shown signs of being ill at ease and had frequently shaken his head at Wellesley's point-blank refusals. "I don't know if it is any use appealing to you, sir," said Meeking. "The witness—" The Coroner leaned towards Wellesley, his whole attitude conciliatory and inviting. "I really think it would be better, doctor, if you could find it in your way to answer Mr. Meeking's question." "I have answered it, sir," interrupted Wellesley. "My answer is no." "Yes, yes, but I don't want the jury to get any false impressions, to draw any wrong conclusions," said the Coroner a little testily. "I feel sure that in your own interest—" "I am not thinking of my own interest," declared Wellesley. "Once again, I shall not give the name of my caller." There was a further pause, during which Meeking and the Coroner exchanged glances. Then Meeking suddenly turned again to the witness box. "Was your caller a man or a woman?" he asked. "That I shan't say," answered Wellesley steadily. "Who admitted him or her?" "I did." "How? By what door of your house?" "By the side door in Piper's Passage." "Did any of your servants see the caller?" "No." "How came that about? You have several servants." "My caller came to that door by arrangement with myself at a certain time, 7:30, was admitted by me, and taken straight up to my drawing-room by a side staircase. My caller left when the interview was over, by the same way." "The interview, then, was a secret one?" "Precisely. Secret, private, confidential." "And you flatly refuse to give us the caller's name?" "Flatly." Meeking hesitated a moment. Then, with a sudden gesture, as though he washed his hands of the whole episode, he dropped back into his seat, bundled his papers together, and made some evidently cynical remark to Hawthwaite, who sat near to him. But Hawthwaite made no response; he was watching the Coroner, and in answer to a questioning glance he shook his head. "No more evidence," whispered Tansley to Brent, as Wellesley, dismissed, stepped down from the witness box. "Whew! This is a queer business, and our non-responsive medical friend may come to rue his obstinacy. I wonder what old Seagrave will make of it. He'll have to sum it all up now." The Coroner was already turning to the jury. He began with his notes of the first day's proceedings, and spent some time over them, but eventually he told his listeners that all that had transpired in the opening stages of the inquiry faded into comparative insignificance when viewed in the light of the evidence they had heard that morning. He analysed that evidence with the acumen of the cute old lawyer that everybody knew him to be, and at last got to what the sharper intellects among his hearers felt, with him, to be the crux of the situation. Was there jealousy of an appreciable nature between Wallingford and Wellesley in respect of Mrs. Saumarez? If there was, and he brushed aside rather cavalierly Wellesley's denial that it existed at the time of Wallingford's death, estimating lightly that denial in the face of the fact that the cause was still there, and that Wellesley had admitted that it had existed at one time, then the evidence, as they had it, clearly showed that between 7:30 and 7:49 on the evening of the late Mayor's death, Wellesley had ready and easy means of access to the Mayor's Parlour. Something might have occurred which had revivified the old jealousy. There might have been a sudden scene, a quarrel, high words. It was a pity, a thousand pities, that Dr. Wellesley refused to give the name of the person who, according to his story, was with him during the 19 minutes' interval which "Going dead against him," whispered Tansley to Brent. "The old chap's taken Meeking's job out of his hands. Good thing this is a coroner's court. If a judge said as much as Seagrave saying to an assize jury, gad, Wellesley would hang. Look at these jurymen. They're half dead certain that Wellesley's guilty already." "Well?" muttered Brent. "I'm not so far off that stage myself. Why didn't he speak out and be done with it? There's been more in that love affair than I guessed at, Tansley. That's where it is. The woman's anxious enough, anyway. Look at her." Mrs. Saumarez had come back into court. She was pale enough and eager enough, and it seemed to Brent that she was almost holding her breath as the old Coroner, in his slow, carefully measured accents and phrases, went on piling up the damning conclusions that might be drawn against Wellesley. "You must not allow yourselves to forget, gentlemen," he was saying, "that Dr. Wellesley's assertion that he was busy with the caller during the fateful 19 minutes is wholly uncorroborated. There were several 4 or 5, I think domestic servants in his establishment, and there was also his assistant in the house, and there were patients going in and out of the surgery, but no one has been brought forward to prove that he was engaged with a visitor in his drawing room. Now, you are only concerned with the evidence that has been put before you, and I am bound to tell you that there is no evidence that Dr. Wellesley had any caller—" A woman's voice suddenly rang out, clear and sharp, from a point of the audience immediately facing the Coroner. "He had! I was the caller." In the excitement of the moment Tansley sprang to his feet, stared, sank back again. "Good God!" he exclaimed. "Mrs. Mallett! Who'd have thought it?" Brent, too, got up and looked. He saw a handsome, determined looking woman standing amidst the closely packed spectators. Mallett sat by her side. He was evidently struck dumb with sudden amazement, and was staring open mouthed at her. On the other side, 2 or 3 men and women, evidently friends, were expostulating with the interrupter. But Mrs. Mallett was oblivious of her husband's wonder and her friend's entreaties. Confronting the Coroner, she spoke again. "Mr. Seagrave, I am the person who called on Dr. Wellesley," she said in a loud, clear voice. "I was there all the time you're discussing, and if you'll let me give evidence you shall have it on my oath. I am not going to sit here and hear an innocent man traduced for lack of a word of mine." The Coroner, who looked none too well pleased at this interruption, motioned Mrs. Mallett to come forward. He waved aside impatiently a protest from Wellesley, who seemed to be begging this voluntary witness to go back to her seat and say nothing, and, as Mrs. Mallett entered the witness box, turned to Meeking. "Perhaps you'll be good enough to examine this witness," he said a little irritably. "These irregular interruptions! But let her say what she has to say." Mrs. Mallett, in Brent's opinion, looked precisely the sort of lady to have her say, and to have it right out. She was calm enough now, and when she had taken the oath and told her questioner formally who she was, she faced him with equanimity. Meeking, somewhat uncertain of his ground, took his cue from the witness's dramatic intervention. "Mrs. Mallett, did you call on Dr. Wellesley at 7:30 on the evening in question, the evening on which Mr. Wallingford met his death?" "I did." "By arrangement?" "Certainly, by arrangement." "When was the arrangement made?" "That afternoon. Dr. Wellesley and I met in the market place about 4 o'clock. We made it then." "Was it to be a strictly private interview?" "Yes, it was. That's why I went to the side door in Piper's Passage." "Did Dr. Wellesley admit you himself?" "Yes, he did, and he took me straight up to his drawing room by a side staircase." "No one saw you going in?" "No, nor leaving either." "Why all this privacy, Mrs. Mallett?" "My business was of a private sort, sir." "Will you tell us what it was?" "I will tell you that I had reasons of my own, my particular own, for seeing Dr. Wellesley and the Mayor." "The Mayor? Did you see the Mayor there?" "No, I meant to see him, but I didn't." "Do you mean that you expected to meet him there, in Dr. Wellesley's drawing room?" "No, Dr. Wellesley had told me of the door between his house and the Moot Hall, and he said that after he and I had had our talk, I could go through that door to the Mayor's Parlour, where I should be sure to find Mr. Wallingford at that time." "I see. Then did you go to see Mr. Wallingford?" "I did." "After talking with Dr. Wellesley?" "Yes, he showed me the way, opened the door for me." "Stay, what time would that be?" "About 7:35 or so. I went along the passage to the Mayor's Parlour, but I never entered." "Never entered? Why, now, Mrs. Mallett?" "Because, as I reached the door, I heard people talking inside the parlour, so I went back." Chapter 14 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Whose voices? Meeking, who by long experience knew the value of dramatic effect in the examination of witnesses, took full advantage of Mrs. Mallett's strange and unexpected announcement. He paused, staring at her. He knew well enough that when he stared other folk would stare too. So for a full moment the situation rested. There stood Mrs. Mallett, resolute and unmoved, in the box, with every eye in the crowded court fixed full upon her, and Meeking, still gazing at her intently, and, of set purpose, half incredulously. There was something intentionally sceptical, cynical, in his tone when at last he spoke. "Do you say, on oath, that you went through the door between Dr. Wellesley's house and the Moot Hall to the Mayor's Parlour that evening?" "To the door of the Mayor's Parlour," corrected Mrs. Mallett. "Yes, I do. I did." "Was the door closed?" "The door was closed." "But you say you heard voices?" "I heard voices within." "Whose voices?" "That I can't say. I couldn't distinguish them." "Well, did you hear the Mayor's voice?" "I tell you I couldn't distinguish any voice. There were two people talking inside the Mayor's Parlour, anyway, in loud voices. It seemed to me that they were both talking at the same time. In fact, I thought—" "What did you think?" demanded Meeking, as Mrs. Mallett paused. "Well, I thought that, whoever they were, the two people were quarrelling. The voices were loud, lifted, angry, I thought." "And yet you couldn't distinguish them?" "No, I couldn't. I might have recognized the Mayor's voice, perhaps, if I'd gone closer to the door and listened, but I didn't stay. As soon as I heard what I have told you of, I went straight back." "By the same way to Dr. Wellesley's drawing room?" "Yes." "What happened then?" "I told Dr. Wellesley that the Mayor had somebody with him, and that they appeared to be having high words, and as I didn't want to stop, he suggested that I should come again next evening. Then I went home." "In the same way, by the private door into Piper's Passage?" "Exactly." "Did Dr. Wellesley go downstairs with you and let you out?" "He did." "See anybody on that occasion?" "No, no one." Meeking paused, and after a glance round the table at which he was standing, looked at his notes. "Now, Mrs. Mallett," he said presently, "what time was this? I mean, when you left Dr. Wellesley's?" "A little before 7:45. The clock struck 7:45 just after I got into my own house." "And where is your house?" "Next door to the Moot Hall. Dr. Wellesley's house is on one side of the Moot Hall, ours is on the other." "It would take you a very short time, then, to go home?" "A minute or two." "Very well. And you went to Dr. Wellesley's at 7:30?" "Just about that." "Then you were with him most of the time you were there, in his drawing room?" "Certainly. All the time except for the 2 or 3 minutes spent in going to the Mayor's Parlour." "Talking to Dr. Wellesley?" "Of course. What do you suppose I went for?" "That's just what I want to find out," retorted Meeking, with a glance that took in the audience, now all agog with excitement. "Will you tell us, Mrs. Mallett?" Mrs. Mallett's handsome face became rigid, and her well-cut lips fixed themselves in a straight line. But she relaxed them to rap out one word. "No." "Come now, Mrs. Mallett. This is a very serious inquiry. It is becoming more serious the more it becomes mysterious, and it is becoming increasingly mysterious. You have already told us that you went secretly to Dr. Wellesley's house in order that you might see him and afterwards the Mayor, Mr. Wallingford. Now, you must have had some very special reason or cause for these interviews. Tell me what it was. What was it, Mrs. Mallett?" "No, that's my business, nobody else's. I shall not say." "Does Dr. Wellesley know what it was?" "Of course. Would the Mayor have known if you'd seen him?" "Considering that that was the object I had in wanting to see him, of course he would," retorted Mrs. Mallett. "I should think that's obvious." "But you didn't see him, eh?" "You know very well I didn't." "Pardon me, madam," said Meeking, with lightning-like promptitude. "I don't know anything of the sort. However, does anyone else know of this business?" "That, too, is my concern," declared Mrs. Mallett, who had bridled indignantly at the barrister's swift reply. "I shan't say it." "Does your husband know of it?" "I'm not going to say that either." "Did your husband, who I believe is one of the Town Trustees, did he know of your visit to Dr. Wellesley's house on this particular occasion?" "I'll answer that. He did not." "Where was he while you were at Dr. Wellesley's? Had you left him at home?" "No, he had gone out before I went out myself. As to where he was, I should say he was either at the Conservative Club or at Mr. Simon Crood's. Is it relevant?" Amidst a ripple of laughter, Meeking made a gesture which signified that he had done with Mrs. Mallett, and she presently stepped down from the witness box. Meeking turned to the Coroner. "I want to have Dr. Wellesley in that box again, sir," he said. "Let Dr. Wellesley be recalled," commanded the Coroner. Wellesley, once more in the full gaze of the court, looked vexed and impatient. Those who had occasionally glanced at him while Mrs. Mallett was giving her evidence had observed that he showed signs of being by no means pleased at the turn things had taken since her sudden intervention. Sometimes he had frowned, once or twice he had muttered to himself, and he now looked blackly at Meeking as the barrister once more confronted him. "You have heard the evidence of the last witness?" asked Meeking abruptly. "All of it," replied Wellesley. "Is it correct as to details of time?" "So far as I recollect, quite." "When Mrs. Mallett went by the private door between your drawing room and the Moot Hall to see the Mayor, what did you do?" "Waited for her in my drawing room." "How long was she away?" "5 minutes, perhaps." "Had you made any appointment with the Mayor on her behalf?" "No, I had not." "You sent her to see him on the chance of her finding him there, in the Mayor's Parlour?" "There was no chance about it. I knew as a good many other people did that just then Wallingford spent almost every evening in the Mayor's Parlour." "Have you ever visited him in the Mayor's Parlour during these evening attendances of his?" "Oh, yes, several times." "By this communicating door?" "Certainly, and he had made use of it in coming to see me." "Do you know what the Mayor was doing on these occasions? I mean, do you know why he spent so much time at the Mayor's Parlour of an evening?" "Yes. He was going as thoroughly as he could into the financial affairs of the Corporation." "Now I want to put a very particular question to you, with the object of getting at some solution of this mystery. What was Mrs. Mallett's business with you and the Mayor?" "I cannot reply to that." "You won't give me an answer?" "I won't. Do you base your refusal on professional privilege, doctor?" "No, not at all. Mrs. Mallett's business was of an absolutely private nature. It had nothing whatever to do with the subject of this inquiry. I tell you that on my honour, on my oath. Nothing whatever." "You mean directly?" Meeking threw a good deal of significance into this question, which he put slowly, and with a peculiarly meaning glance at his witness. But Wellesley either did not see or affected not to see any significance, and his answer came promptly. I mean precisely what I say, as I always do." Meeking leaned across the table, eyeing Wellesley still more closely. "Do you think, knowing all that you do now, that it had anything to do with it indirectly? Indirectly?" Self-controlled though he was, Wellesley could not repress a start of surprise at this question. It was obviously unexpected, and it seemed to those who, like Brent and Tansley, were watching him narrowly, that he was considerably taken aback by it. He hesitated. "I want an answer to that," said Meeking, after a pause. "Well," replied Wellesley at last, "I can't say. What I mean by that is that I am not in a position to say. I am not sufficiently acquainted with let me call them facts to be able to say. What I do say is that Mrs. Mallett's business with me and with Wallingford that evening was of an essentially private nature, and had nothing whatever to do with what happened in the Mayor's Parlour just about the time she was in my drawing room." "That is, as far as you are aware?" "As far as I am aware, yes. But I am quite sure it hadn't." "You can't give this court any information that would help to solve this problem?" "I cannot." "Well, a question or two more. When Mrs. Mallett left you at your door in Piper's Passage I mean when you let her out, just before 7:45, what did you next do?" "I went upstairs again to my drawing room." "May I ask why?" "Yes, I thought of going to see Wallingford in the Mayor's Parlour." "Did you go?" "No. I should have gone, but I suddenly remembered that I had an appointment with a patient in Meadowgate at 10 minutes to 8 o'clock. So I went back to the surgery, exchanged my jacket for a coat, and went out." "On your oath, have you the slightest idea as to who killed John Wallingford?" "I have not the least idea. I never had." Meeking nodded, as much as to imply that he had no further questions to ask. When his witness had stepped down, he turned to the Coroner. "I should like to have Bunning, the caretaker, recalled, sir," he said. "I want to ask him certain questions which have just occurred to me. Bunning," he continued, when the ex-sergeant had been summoned to the witness box, "I want you to give me some information about the relation of your rooms to the upper portion of the Moot Hall. You live in rooms on the ground floor, don't you? Yes? Very well, now, is there any entrance to your rooms other than that at the front of the building the entrance from the market place?" "Yes, sir. There's an entrance from St. Lawrence Lane at the back." "Is there any way from your rooms to the upper floors of the Moot Hall?" "Yes, sir. There's a back stair from our back door." "Could anybody reach the Mayor's Parlour by that stair?" "They could, sir, certainly, but either me or my wife would see them." "Just so, if you were in your rooms. But you told us in your first evidence that from about 7:20 or so until 8 o'clock you were smoking your pipe at the market place entrance to the Moot Hall, where, of course, you couldn't see your back door. That correct? Very well. Now, while you were at the front, was your wife in the rooms at the back?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know what she was doing?" "I do, sir. She was getting our supper ready." "Are you sure she never left the house your rooms, you know?" Bunning started. Obviously a new idea had occurred. "Aye!" said Meeking with a smile. "Just so, Bunning. You're not sure?" "Well, sir," replied Bunning slowly, "now that I come to think of it, I'm not. It never occurred to me before, but during that time my missus may have been out of the place for a few minutes or so to fetch the supper beer, sir." "To be sure. Now where does Mrs. Bunning get your supper beer?" "At the Chancellor Vault, sir, round the corner." Meeking turned quietly to the Coroner. "I think we ought to have Mrs. Bunning's evidence," he remarked. It took 10 minutes to fetch Mrs. Bunning from her rooms in the lower regions of the old Moot Hall. She came at last, breathless and in her working attire, and turned a wondering, good-natured face on the barrister. "Just a little question or two, Mrs. Bunning," he said half indifferently. "On the evening of the late Mayor's death, did you go out to the Chancellor Vaults to fetch your supper beer?" "I did, sir, just as usual." "What time?" "A bit earlier than usual, sir. 7:30." "How long were you away?" "Why, sir, to tell you the truth, nigh on to half an hour. I met a neighbour at the corner at—" "Exactly. And stopped chatting a bit. So you were out of your rooms in the Moot Hall that evening from 7:30 to nearly 8 o'clock?" "Yes, sir." Meeking gave the Coroner a glance, thrust his hands into his pockets, and dropped back into his seat, silent and apparently satisfied. Chapter 15 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Special Edition. But if the barrister was satisfied with the possibilities suggested by this new evidence, the gist of which had apparently altered the whole aspect of the case, the Coroner obviously was not. Ever since Mrs. Mallett had interrupted his summing up to the jury, he had shown signs of fidgetiness. He had continually put on and taken off his spectacles, he had moved restlessly in his chair, now and then he had seemed on the point of interrupting counsel or witnesses. It was evident that things were not at all to his liking. And now, as Meeking sat down, the Coroner turned to Mrs. Bunning, who stood, looking wonderingly about her, and still fingering the apron in which she had been found at her work. "Mrs. Bunning," he said, "I want to ask you some questions about this back entrance of yours. What is it, a door opening out of the rear of the Moot Hall?" "Yes, sir, that's it, sir." "Does it open on St. Lawrence Lane?" "Yes, sir." "What does it open into? A hall, lobby, passage, or what?" "A lobby, sir, next to our living room." "Is there a staircase, then, in that lobby? I mean, by which you can get to the upper rooms in the Moot Hall?" "Oh, yes, sir. That's the staircase we use, me and my husband, when we go up for cleaning and dusting, sir." "Then if anybody went in by that door while you were out that evening, whoever it was could go up that staircase to the upper rooms?" "Oh, yes, sir, they could." "And get to the Mayor's Parlour?" "Yes, sir. The staircase opens on to the big landing, sir, and the door of the Mayor's Parlour is at the far end of it." "And you were out of your rooms for half an hour that evening?" "Just about that, sir. It would be a bit after 7:30 when I went out, and it was just before 8 when I went in again." "Did you notice anything that made you think that somebody had been in?" "Oh, no, sir, nothing." "Had you left your door open, your outer door?" "Yes, sir, a bit ajar. Of course I never thought to be away many minutes, sir." "Very good. That's all, thank you, Mrs. Bunning," said the Coroner. He looked round the court. "Is the Borough Surveyor still there?" he asked. "Mr. Walkershaw? Let him come into the witness box again." But the Borough Surveyor had gone, nor was he to be found in his office in another part of the building. Once more the Coroner looked round. "I dare say we are all quite familiar with what I may call the geography of St. Lawrence Lane," he remarked, "but I want some formal evidence about it that can be put on the record. I see Mr. Krevin Crood there. I believe Mr. Crood is as big an authority on Hathelsborough as anybody living. Perhaps he'll oblige me by coming forward." Krevin Crood, sitting at the front of the densely packed mass of spectators, rose and walked into the witness box. The Coroner leaned confidentially in his direction. "Mr. Crood," he said, "I think you're perfectly familiar with St. Lawrence Lane, in its relation to the immediately surrounding property?" "I am, sir," replied Krevin. "Every inch of it." "Just describe it to us, as if we knew nothing about it," continued the Coroner. "You know what I want, and what I mean." "Certainly, sir," assented Krevin. "St. Lawrence Lane is a narrow thoroughfare, about 80 to 90 yards in length, which lies at the back of Mr. Mallett's house I mean the bank premises, the Moot Hall, and Dr. Wellesley's house. Its north entrance, at the corner of the bank, is in Woolmarket, its south in Strand Lane. On its west side there is a back door to the bank house, another into Bunning's rooms on the basement of the Moot Hall, a third into the police office, also in that basement, a fourth into the rear of Dr. Wellesley's house. On the opposite side of the lane, the east, there is nothing but St. Lawrence's Church and churchyard. St. Lawrence's Church tower and the west end faces the back of the Moot Hall. There is a part of the churchyard opposite the bank premises, the rear premises. The rest of the churchyard faces Dr. Wellesley's house. The back of it, of course. Is the lane much frequented? No, sir. It is very little used, except by tradesmen going to Mr. Mallett's or to Dr. Wellesley's back doors, and by people going to the police office it is scarcely used at all. There is no traffic along it. On Sundays, of course, it is used by people going to the services at St. Lawrence. Would it be likely to be quiet, unfrequented of an evening? Emphatically, yes. Do you think it likely that any person wishing to enter the Moot Hall unobserved, and seeing Mrs. Bunning go away from her rooms and round the corner to the Chancellor vaults, as we've just heard she did, could slip in unseen? Oh, to be sure, affirmed Krevin. The easiest thing in the world. If I may suggest something? Go on, said the Coroner, waving his spectacles. Anything that helps. Suggest what you like. Well, said Krevin, slowly and thoughtfully, if I may put it in my own way. Suppose that there is somebody in the town who is desirous of finding the late Mayor alone in the Mayor's Parlour, being also cognizant of the fact, well known to many people, that the late Mr. Wallingford was to be found there every evening? Suppose, too, that that person was well acquainted with the geography of St. Lawrence Lane and the Moot Hall? Suppose, further, that he or she was also familiar with the fact that Mrs. Bunning invariably went out every evening to fetch the supper beer from the Chancellor vaults. Such a person could easily enter the Bunnings' back door with an absolutely minimum risk of detection. The churchyard of St. Lawrence is edged with thick shrubs and trees. Anybody could easily hide amongst the shrub, laurel, myrtle, ivy, watch for Mrs. Bunnings going out, and, when she had gone, slip across the lane, a very narrow one, and enter the door which, as she says, she left open. It would not take 2 minutes for any person who knew the place to pass from St. Lawrence churchyard to the Mayor's Parlour, or from the Mayor's Parlour to St. Lawrence churchyard. A murmur of comprehension and understanding ran round the court. Most of the people present knew St. Lawrence Lane and the Moot Hall as well as Krevin Crood knew them. His suggestion appealed to their common sense. And Tansley, with a sudden start, turned to Brent. "That's done it," he whispered. "Everybody tumbles to that. We've been going off on all sorts of side tracks all the morning. Now Wellesley, now Mrs. Mallett, and now here's another. Access to the Mayor's Parlour. There you are. Easy as winking, on Krevin Crood's theory. Lay you a fiver to a shilling old Seagrave won't go on any farther." Herein Tansley was quickly proved to be right. The Coroner was showing unmistakable symptoms of his satiety for the time being. He thanked Krevin Crood punctiliously for his assistance, and once again, toying restlessly with his spectacles, turned to the jury, who, on their part, looked blank and doubtful. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "it seems to me that the entire complexion of this matter is changed by the evidence we have heard since Mrs. Mallett broke in so unexpectedly upon what I was saying to you. I don't propose now to say any more as regards the evidence of either Dr. Wellesley or Mrs. Mallett. Since we heard what they have had to say, we have learnt a good deal which I think will be found to have more importance than we attach to it at present. As matters stand, the evidence of Mrs. Bunning is of supreme importance. There is no doubt whatever that there was easy means of access to the Mayor's Parlour during that half hour wherein the Mayor met his death. The mystery of the whole affair has deepened considerably during today's proceedings, and instead of bringing this inquiry to a definite conclusion, I feel that I must wait for more evidence. I adjourn this inquest for a month from today." The court cleared. The spectators filtered out into the market-place in various moods and under different degrees of excitement. Some were openly disappointed that the jury had not been allowed to return a verdict. Some were vehement in declaring that the jury never would return a verdict. Here and there were men who wagged their heads sagely and remarked with sinister smiles that they knew what they thought about it. But within the rapidly emptying court, Brent, Tansley and Hawthwaite were grouped around Meeking. The barrister was indulging in some private remarks upon the morning's proceedings, chiefly addressed to the police superintendent. "There's no doubt about it, you know," he was saying. "The evidence of the Bunning woman, supplemented by what Krevin Crood said, which was a mere formal crystallizing of common knowledge, has altered the whole thing. Here's the back entrance to the Moot Hall left absolutely unprotected, unguarded, unwatched, whatever you like to call it, for half an hour, the critical half hour. Of course the murderer got up to the Mayor's Parlour that way, and got away by the same means. You're as far off as ever, Hawthwaite, and it's a pity you wasted time on that jealousy business. I watched Wellesley closely, and I believe that he spoke the truth when he said that whatever there might have been, there was no jealousy about Mrs. Saumarez between him and Wallingford at the end. My own impression is that Wellesley was clear off with Mrs. Saumarez." Hawthwaite, essentially a man of fixed ideas, looked sullen. "Well, it isn't mine, then," he growled, "from all I've learned, and I've chances and opportunities that most folks haven't. My impression is that both men were after her right up to the time Wallingford was murdered. I can tell you this, and I could have put it in evidence if I thought it worth while. Wellesley used to go and see her of an evening, constantly, up to a very recent date, though she was supposed to have broken off with him and to be on with the Mayor. Now then." "Do you know that for a fact, Hawthwaite?" asked Tansley. "I know it for a fact. He used to go there late at night and stop late. If you want to know where I got it was from a young woman that used to be housemaid at the Abbey House, Mrs. Saumarez's place. She's told me a lot. Both Wallingford and Wellesley used to visit there a good deal, but, as I say, Wellesley used to go there very late of an evening. This young woman says that she knows for a fact that he was often with her mistress till close on midnight. I don't care twopence what Wellesley said. I believe he was, and is, after her, and of course he'd be jealous enough about her being so friendly with Wallingford. There's a deal more in all this than's come out yet, let me tell you that." "I don't think anybody will contradict you, Hawthwaite," observed the barrister dryly. "But the pertinent fact is what I tell you, the fact of access. Somebody got to the Mayor's Parlour by way of the back staircase through Bunning's rooms that evening. Who was it? That's what you've got to find out. If you'd only found out before now that Mrs. Bunning took half an hour to fetch the supper beer that night, we should have been spared a lot of talk this morning. As things are, we're as wise as ever." Then Meeking, with a cynical laugh, picked up his papers and went off, and Brent, leaving Tansley talking to the superintendent, who was inclined to be huffy, strolled out of the Moot Hall and went round to the back, with the idea of seeing for himself the narrow street which Krevin Crood had formerly described. He saw at once that Krevin was an admirable exponent of the art of description. Everything in St. Lawrence Lane was as the ex-official had said. There was the door into the Bunnings' rooms, and there facing it the ancient church and its equally ancient churchyard. It was to the churchyard that Brent gave most attention. He immediately realized that Krevin Crood was quite right in speaking of it as a place wherein anybody could conveniently hide. A dark, gloomy, sheltered, high-walled place, filled with thick shrubbery, out of which here and there grew sombre yew trees, some of them of an antiquity as venerable as that of the church itself. It would be a very easy thing indeed, Brent decided, for any designing person to hide amongst these trees and shrubs, watch the Bunnings' door until Mrs. Bunning left it, jug in hand, and then to slip across the grass-grown, cobble-paved lane, silent and lonely enough, and up to the Mayor's Parlour. But all that presupposed knowledge of the place and of its people and their movements. He went back to the market-place and towards the Chancellor. Peppermore came hurrying out of the hotel as Brent turned into it. He carried a folded paper in his hand, and he waved it at Brent as, at the sight of him, he came to a sudden halt. "Just been looking for you, Mr. Brent," he said mysteriously. "Come into some quiet spot, sir, and glance at this. Here we are, sir, corner of the hall." He drew Brent into an alcove that opened close by them, and affecting a mysterious air began to unfold his paper, a sheet of newsprint which, Brent's professional eye was quick to see, had just been pulled as a proof. "All that affair to day, Mr. Brent," he whispered. "Most unsatisfactory, sir, most unsatisfactory, unconvincing, inconclusive, Mr. Brent. The thing's getting no farther, sir, no farther, except of course for the very pertinent fact about Mrs. Bunning's absence from her quarters that fateful evening. My own impression, sir, is that Hawthwaite and all the rest of 'em don't know the right way of going about this business. But the Monitor's going to wade in, sir, the Monitor is coming to the rescue. Look here, sir, we're going to publish a special edition to night with a full account of to day's proceedings at the inquest, and with it we're going to give away as a gratis supplement what do you think, sir? This, produced at great cost, sir, in the interest of justice. Look at it." Therewith Peppermore, first convincing himself that he and his companion were secure from observation, spread out before Brent a square sheet of very damp paper, strongly redolent of printer's ink, at the head of which appeared in big, bold, black characters the question: "Who typed this letter?" Beneath it, excellently reproduced, was a facsimile of the typewritten letter which Wallingford had shown to Epplewhite and afterwards left in his keeping. And beneath that was a note in large italics inviting anyone who could give any information as to the origin of the document to communicate with the editor of the Monitor at once. "What do you think of that for a coup, Mr. Brent?" demanded Peppermore proudly. "Up to Fleet Street form, that, sir, ain't it? I borrowed the original, sir, had it carefully reproduced in facsimile, and persuaded my proprietor to go to the expense of having sufficient copies struck off on this specially prepared paper to give one away with every copy of the Monitor that we shall print to-night. 5,000 copies, Mr. Brent! That facsimile, sir, will be all over Hathelsborough by supper time." "Smart!" observed Brent. "Top hole idea, Peppermore. And you hope—" "There aren't so many typewriters in Hathelsborough as all that," replied Peppermore. "I hope that somebody'll come forward who can tell something. Do you notice, sir, that this has been done, the original, I mean, on an old fashioned machine, and that the lettering is considerably worn, sir? I hope the Monitor's efforts will solve the mystery." "Much obliged to you," said Brent. "There's a lot of spade work to do yet." He was thinking over the best methods of further attempts on that spade work when, late that evening, he received a note from Queenie Crood. It was confined to one line: "Tomorrow usual place 3 urgent. Q." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Castle Wall. Brent went to bed that night wondering what it was that Queenie Crood wanted. Since their first meeting in the Castle grounds they had met frequently. He was getting interested in Queenie; she developed on acquaintance. Instead of being the meek and mild mouse of Simon Crood's domestic hearth that Brent had fancied her to be on his visit to the tannery, he was discovering possibilities in her that he had not suspected. She had spirit, an imagination, and a continually rebellious desire to get out of Simon Crood's cage and spread her wings in flight, anywhere so long as Hathelsborough was left behind. She had told Brent plainly that she had thought him foolish for buying property in the town. What was there in that rotten old borough, said Queenie, to keep any man of spirit and enterprise there? Brent argued the point in his downright way. It was his job, he conceived, to take up his cousin's work where it had been laid down. He was going to regenerate Hathelsborough. "And that you'll never do," affirmed Queenie. "You might as well try to blow up the castle keep with a halfpenny cracker." Hathelsborough people are like the man in the Bible. They're joined to their idols. You can try and try, and you'll only break your heart, or your back, in the effort, just as Wallingford would have done. If Wallingford had been a wise man, he'd have let Hathelsborough go to the devil in its own way, then he'd have been alive now." "Well, I'm going to try," declared Brent. "I said I would, and I will. You wait till I'm elected to the Town Council. Then we'll see." "It's fighting a den of wild beasts," said Queenie. "You won't have a rag left on you when they're through with you." She used to tell him at these meetings of the machinations of Simon Crood and Coppinger and Mallett against his chances of success in the Castle Ward election. According to her, they were moving heaven and earth to prevent him from succeeding Wallingford. Evidently believing Queenie to be a tame bird that carried no tails, they were given to talking freely before her during their nightly conclaves. Brent heard a good deal about the underhand methods in which municipal elections are carried on in small country towns, and was almost as much amused as amazed at the unblushing corruption and chicanery of which Queenie told him. And now he fancied that she had some special news of a similar sort to give him. The election was close at hand, and he knew that Simon and his gang were desperately anxious to defeat him. Although Simon had been elected to the mayoralty, his party in the Town Council was in a parlous position. At present it had a majority of 1. If Brent were elected, that majority would disappear, and there were signs that at the annual elections in the coming November it would be transformed into a minority. Moreover, the opponent whom Brent had to face in this by-election was a strong man, a well-known, highly respected ratepayer, who, though an adherent of the old party, was a fair-minded and moderate politician, and likely to secure the suffrages of the non-party electors. It was going to be a stiff fight, and Brent was thankful for the occasional insights into the opposition's plans of campaign which Queenie was able to give him. But there were other things than this to think about, and he thought much as he lay wakeful in bed that night and as he dressed next morning. The proceedings at the adjourned inquest had puzzled him, left him doubtful and uncertain. He was not sure about the jealousy theory. He was not sure about Mrs. Saumarez, from what he had seen of her personally and from what he had heard of her. He was inclined to believe that she was not only a dabbler in politics, with a liking for influencing men who were concerned in them, but that she was also the sort of woman who likes to have more than one man in leash. He was now disposed to think that there had been love passages between her and Wallingford, and not only between her and Wallingford, but between her and Wellesley. There might, after all, be something in the jealousy idea. But then came in the curious episode of Mrs. Mallett, and the mystery attaching to it. As things presented themselves at present, there seemed to be no chance whatever that either Mrs. Mallett or Wellesley would lift the veil on what was evidently a secret between them. The only satisfactory and straightforward feature about yesterday's proceedings, he thought, was the testimony of Mrs. Bunning as to her unguarded door. Now, at any rate, it was a sure thing that there had been ready means of access to the Mayor's Parlour that evening. What was necessary was to discover who it was that had taken advantage of them. After breakfast, Brent went round to see Hawthwaite. Hawthwaite gave him a chair and eyed him expectantly. "We don't seem to be going very fast ahead," remarked Brent. "Mr. Brent!" exclaimed Hawthwaite. "I assure you we're doing all we can. But did you ever know a more puzzling case? Between you and me, I'm not at all convinced about either Dr. Wellesley or Mrs. Mallett. There's a mystery there which I can't make out. They may have said the truth, and they mayn't, and " "Cut them out," interrupted Brent. "For the time being, anyway. We got some direct evidence yesterday, for the first time." "As how?" questioned Hawthwaite. "That door into Bunning's room," replied Brent. "That's where the murderer slipped in." "Aye, but did he?" said Hawthwaite. "If one could be certain " "Look here," asserted Brent. "There is one thing that is certain dead certain. That handkerchief." "Well?" asked Hawthwaite. "That should be followed up more," continued Brent. "There's no doubt whatever that that handkerchief, which Wellesley admits is his, got sent by mistake to one or other of Mrs. Marriner's other customers. That's flat. Now you can trace it." "How?" exclaimed Hawthwaite. "A small article like that?" "It can be done, with patience," said Brent. "It's got to be done. That handkerchief got into somebody's hands. That somebody is probably the murderer. As to how it can be traced well, I suggest this. As far as I'm conversant with laundry matters, families, such as Mrs. Marriner says she works for, have laundry books. These books are checked, I believe, when the washing's sent home. If there's an article missing, the person who does the checking notes it. If a wrong article's enclosed, that too is noted and returned to the laundry." "If Wellesley's handkerchief got to the wrong place, why wasn't it returned?" demanded Hawthwaite. "To be sure, but that's just what you've got to find out," retorted Brent. "You ought to go to Mrs. Marriner's laundry and make an exhaustive search of her books, lists and so on, till you get some light. See?" "Mrs. Marriner has, I should say, 100 customers," remarked Hawthwaite. "Don't matter if Mrs. Marriner's got 500 customers," said Brent. "That's got to be seen into. If you aren't going to do it, I will. Whoever it was that was in that Mayor's Parlour tried to burn a blood-stained handkerchief there. That handkerchief was Wellesley's. Wellesley swears he was never near the Mayor's Parlour. I believe him. So that handkerchief got by error into the box or basket of some other customer of Mrs. Marriner. Trace it." He rose and moved towards the door, and Hawthwaite nodded. "We'll make a try at it, Mr. Brent," he said. "But, as I say, to work on a slight clue like that " "I've known of far slighter clues," replied Brent. Yet as he went away he reflected on the extreme thinness of this clue. It was possible that the handkerchief had passed through more hands than one before settling in those of the person who had thrown it on the hearth, stained with Wallingford's blood, in the Mayor's Parlour. But it was a clue, and, in Brent's opinion, the clue. One fact in relation to it had always struck him forcibly. The murderer of his cousin was either a very careless and thoughtless person, or had been obliged to quit the Mayor's Parlour very hurriedly. Anyone meticulously particular about destroying clues or covering up traces would have seen to it that the handkerchief was completely burnt up before leaving the room. As it was, it seemed to Brent that the murderer had either thrown the handkerchief on the hearth, seen it catch fire, and paid no more attention to it, which would denote carelessness, or had quitted the place immediately after flinging it aside, which would imply that some sound from without had startled him or her. And was it him or was it her? There were certain features of the case which had inclined Brent of late to speculating on the possibility that his cousin had been murdered by a woman. And to be sure, a woman was now in the case Mrs. Mallett. If only he knew why Mrs. Mallett went to see the doctor and the Mayor. But that, after all, was mere speculation, and he had a busy morning before him in relation to his election business. He had been continuously engaged all the time, when at 3 o'clock he hurried to the Castle grounds to meet Queenie. He found her in her usual haunt, a quiet spot in the angle of a wall, where she was accustomed to sit and read. "Well, and why urgent?" asked Brent, as he dropped on the seat at her side. "To make sure that you'd come," retorted Queenie. "Didn't want to leave it to chance." "I'm here," said Brent. "Go ahead with the business." "Did you see the Monitor last night, and that facsimile they gave away with it?" inquired Queenie. "I did. Saw the facsimile before it was published. Peppermore showed it to me." "Very well. That's the urgent business. I know whose machine that letter the original, I mean was typed on." "You do? Great Scott! Whose, then?" "Uncle Simon Crood's. Fact." "Whew! So the old fossil's got such a modern invention as a typewriter, has he? And you think " "Don't think! I know! He's had a typewriter for years. It's an old fashioned thing, a good deal worn out. He rarely uses it, but now and then he operates with one finger, slowly, and that letter originated from him, his machine." "Proof," said Brent. Queenie took up a book that lay on the seat between them, and from it extracted a folded copy of the Monitor's facsimile. She leaned nearer to Brent. "Now look," she said. "Do you notice that 2 or 3 of the letters are broken? That M, part of it's gone. That O, half made. The top of that A is missing. More noticeable still, do you see that small T there is slanting the wrong way? Well, all that's on Uncle Simon's machine. I knew where that letter had originated as soon as ever I saw this facsimile last night." She laid aside the supplement, and once more opening her book, produced a sheet of paper. "Look at this," she continued. "When Uncle Simon went out to the tannery this morning, I just took advantage of his absence to type out the alphabet on his machine. Now then, you glance over that and compare the faulty letters with those in the facsimile. What do you say now?" "You're a smart girl, Queenie," said Brent. "You're just the sort of girl I've been wanting to meet the sort that can see things when they're right in front of her eyes. Oh, my! That's sure, positive proof that old Simon—" "Oh!" broke in Queenie sharply. "Oh, I say!" Before Brent could look up, he was conscious that a big and bulky shadow had fallen across the gravelled path at their feet. He lifted his eyes. There, in his usual raiment of funereal black, his top hat at the back of his head, his hands behind him under the ample skirts of his frock coat, his broad, fat face heavy with righteous and affectedly sorrowful indignation, stood Simon Crood. His small, pig-like eyes were fixed on the papers which the 2 young people were comparing. "Hullo!" exclaimed Brent. He was quick to see that he and Queenie were in for a row, probably for a row of a decisive sort which would affect both their lives, and he purposely threw as much hearty insolence into his tone as he could summon. "Eavesdropping, eh, Mr. Crood?" Simon withdrew a hand from the sable folds behind him and waved it in lordly fashion. "I've no words to waste on impudent young fellers as comes from nobody knows where," he said loftily. "My words is addressed to my niece, as I see sitting there, a deceiving of her lawful relative and guardian. Go you home at once, miss." "Rot!" exclaimed Brent. "She'll go home when she likes, and not at all if she doesn't like. You stick where you are, Queenie. I'm here." And as if to prove the truth of his words, he slipped his right arm round Queenie's waist, clasped it tightly, and turned a defiant eye on Simon. "See that?" he said. "Well, that's just where Queenie stops as long as ever Queenie likes. Eh, Queenie?" The girl, reddening as Brent's arm slipped round her, instinctively laid her free hand on his wrist. And, as he appealed to her, he felt her fingers tighten there with a firm, understanding pressure. "That's all right," he whispered to her. "We've done it, girlie. It's for good." He looked up at Simon, whose mouth was opening with astonishment. "Queenie's my girl, old bird," he went on. "She isn't going anywhere not anywhere at all, at anybody's bidding, unless she likes. And why shouldn't she be here?" It seemed, from the pause that followed, as if Simon would never find his tongue again. But at last he spoke. "So this here is what's been going on behind my back, is it, miss?" he demanded pointedly, ignoring Brent and fixing his gaze on Queenie. "A carrying on with strangers at my very gates, as you might say, and in public places in a town of which I'm chief magistrate? What sort of return do you call this, miss, I should like to know, for all that I've done for you, me that's lodged and boarded and clothed you ever since—" "What have I done for you in return?" demanded Queenie with a flash of spirit. "Saved you the wages of a couple of servants for all these years. But this is the end, if you're going to throw that in my teeth." Brent drew Queenie to her feet and turned her away from Simon. He gave the big man a look over his shoulder. "That's it, my friend," he said. "That's the right term the end. Find somebody else to do your household drudgery. This young lady's done her last stroke for you. And now don't begin to bluster," he added, as Simon, purpling with wrath, shook his fist. "We'll just leave you to yourself." He led Queenie away down a side path, and once within its shelter, put a finger under her chin, and lifting her face, looked steadily at her. "Look here, girlie," he said. "You heard what I whispered to you just now? It's for good. Didn't I say that? Well, is it?" Queenie managed to get her eyes to turn on him at last. "Do you mean it?" she murmured. "I just do," answered Brent fervently. "Say the word." "Yes, then," whispered Queenie. She looked at him wonderingly when he had bent and kissed her. "You're an extraordinary man," she said. "Whatever am I going to do now? Homeless!" "Not much!" exclaimed Brent. "You come along with me, Queenie. I'm a good hand at thinking fast. I'll put you up warm and comfortable at Mother Appleyard's, and as quick as the thing can be done we'll be married. Got that into your little head? Come on, then!" That night Brent told Tansley of what had happened and what he was going to do. Tansley listened, laughed and shook his head. "All right, my lad," he said. "I've no doubt you and Queenie'll suit each other excellently. But you've settled your chances of winning the election, Brent. Simon Crood'll bring up every bit of his heavy artillery against you now, and will smash you." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Impregnable. Brent received this plain-spoken declaration with a curious tightening of lips and setting of jaw, which Tansley, during their brief acquaintance, had come to know well enough. They were accompanied by a fixed stare. The solicitor knew that too. These things meant that Brent's fighting spirit was roused and that his temper became ugly. Tansley laughed. "You're the sort of chap for a scrap, Brent," he continued, "and a go-ahead customer too. But you don't know this lot, nor their resources. Whatever anybody may say, and whatever men like your late cousin and Epplewhite and any of the so-called progressives I'm not one myself, it pays me to belong to neither party whatever these folks may think or say, Simon Crood and his lot are top dogs in this little old town. Vested interests, my boy, ancient tree with roots firmly fixed in the piled-up soil, strata upon strata of 1,000 years. You're not going to pull up these roots, my lad." "How'll Simon Crood smash me?" demanded Brent quietly. "As to the exact how," answered Tansley, "can't say. Mole work, but he'll set the majority of the electors in that Castle ward against you." "I've enough promises of support now to give me a majority," retorted Brent. "That for promises!" exclaimed Tansley, snapping his fingers. "You don't know Hathelsborough people. They'll promise you their support to your face, just to get rid of your presence on their doorsteps, and vote against you when they reach the ballot box. I'll lay anything most of the folk you've been to see have promised their support to both candidates." "Why should these people support Crood and his crew?" demanded Brent. "Because Crood and his crew represent the only god they worship," said Tansley, with a cynical laugh. "Brass, as they call it. All that a Hathelsborough man thinks about is brass. Money. Get money where you can, never mind how, as long as you can get it, and keep just within the law. Simon Crood represents the Hathelsborough principle of graft, and whatever you may think, he's the paramount influence in the town today." "He and his lot have only got the barest majority on the council," remarked Brent. "Maybe. But they've got all the really influential men behind 'em, the moneyed men," said Tansley, "and they've distributed all the various official posts, sinecures most of them, among their friends. That Town Trustee business is the nut to crack here, Brent, and a nut that's been hardening for centuries isn't going to be cracked with an ordinary implement. Come now, are you an extraordinary one?" "I'll make a try at things anyway," replied Brent, "and I don't believe I shall lose that election either." "You might have scraped in if you hadn't carried Simon Crood's niece away from under his very nose," said Tansley. But now that you've brought personal matters into the quarrel, the old chap'll move every piece he has on the board to checkmate you. It won't do to have you on the council, Brent. You're too much of an innovator. Now, this town, the real town, doesn't want innovation. Innovation in an ancient borough like this is unsettling and uncomfortable. See?" "This world doesn't stand still," retorted Brent. "I'm going ahead." But he reflected as he left the solicitor's office that much of what Tansley had said was true. There was something baffling in the very atmosphere of Hathelsborough. He felt like a man who fights the wind. Everything was elusive, ungraspable, evasive. He seemed to get no further forward. And if Tansley was right in affirming that Hathelsborough people made promises which they had no intention of redeeming, his chances of getting a seat on the town council and setting to work to rebuild his late cousin's schemes of reformation were small indeed. But once more he set his jaw and nerved himself to endeavour, and, as the day of the election was now close at hand, plunged into the task of canvassing and persuading, wondering all the time, now that he had heard Tansley's cynical remarks, if the people to whom he talked and who were mostly plausible and ingratiating in their reception of him were in reality laughing at him for his pains. He saw little of the efforts of the other side, but Peppermore agreed with Tansley that the opposition would leave no stone unturned in the task of beating him. The Monitor was all for Brent. Peppermore's proprietor was a progressive, a tradesman who had bought up the Monitor for a mere song and ran it as a business speculation which had so far turned out very satisfactorily. Consequently, Brent at this period went much to the Monitor office, and did things in concert with Peppermore, inspiring articles which, to say the least of them, were severely critical of the methods of the Crood regime. On one of these visits, Peppermore, in the middle of a discussion about one of these effusions, abruptly switched off the trend of his thought in another direction. "I'd a visit from Mrs. Saumarez this morning, Mr. Brent," he said, eyeing his companion with a knowing look. "Pretty and accomplished woman, that, sir. But queer, Mr. Brent, queer." "What do you mean?" asked Brent. "Odd ideas, sir, very odd," replied Peppermore. "Wanted to find out from me, Mr. Brent, if in case she's called up again at this inquest business, or if circumstances arise which necessitate police proceedings at which she might be a witness, her name couldn't be suppressed. Ever hear such a proposal, sir, to make to a journalist? Impossible, my dear madam, says I. Publicity, ma'am, I says, well, it's the very salt of life, as you might term it, I says. When gentlemen of our profession report public affairs, we keep nothing back, I says, firmly, sir. I very much object to my name figuring in these proceedings, she says. I object very strongly indeed. Can't help it, ma'am, says I. If the highest in the land was called into a witness box and I reported the case, I says, I should have to give the name. It's the glory of our profession, Mrs. Saumarez. I says, just as it's that of the law, that we don't countenance hole and corner business. The light of day, ma'am, the light of day. That's the idea, Mrs. Saumarez, I says. Let the clear, unclouded radiance of high noon, ma'am, shine on. But you know what I mean, Mr. Brent. As I said to her, the publicity that's attendant on all this sort of thing in England is one of the very finest of our national institutions. Odd, sir, but for a woman that's supposed to be modern and progressive, she didn't agree. I don't want to see my name in the papers in connection with this affair, Mr. Peppermore, she declared again. I thought perhaps, she says, rather coaxingly, that you could suggest some way of keeping it out if there are any further proceedings. Can't, ma'am, says I. If such an eventuality comes to be, it'll be my duty to record faithfully and fully in the Monitor whatever takes place. Oh, says she, but it's not the Monitor that I so much object to. It's the London papers. I understand that you supply the reports to them, Mr. Peppermore. Well, of course, as you know, Mr. Brent, I am district correspondent for two of the big London agencies, but I had to explain to her that in a sensational case like this, the London papers generally sent down men of their own. There were, for instance, 2 or 3 London reporters present the other day." "Yes," she said, so she'd heard, and she'd got all the London papers to see if her name was mentioned, and had been relieved to find that it hadn't. There were nothing but summarized reports; her name hadn't appeared anywhere but in the Monitor. And what I wanted, Mr. Peppermore, she says, more wheedlingly than ever, was that, if it lay in your power, and if occasion arises, you would do what you could to keep my name out of it. I don't want publicity." Concluded Peppermore. "Pretty woman, Mr. Brent, and with taking ways, but of course I had to be adamant, sir, firm, Mr. Brent, firm as St. Hathelswide's tower. 'The press, Mrs. Saumarez,' I says, as I dismissed the matter, politely, of course, 'has its duties. It can make no exception, Mrs. Saumarez, to wealth or rank or beauty.' I made her a nice bow, Mr. Brent, as I spoke the last word. But she wasn't impressed. As I say, queer woman. What's publicity matter to her as long as she's no more than a witness?" Brent was not particularly impressed by Peppermore's story. He saw nothing in it beyond the natural desire of a sensitive, highly strung woman to keep herself aloof from an unpleasant episode, and he said so. "I don't see what good Hawthwaite hoped to get by ever calling Mrs. Saumarez before the Coroner," he added. "She told nothing that everybody didn't know. What did it all amount to?" "Ay, but that's just it, in a town like this, Mr. Brent," answered Peppermore with a wink. "I can tell you why the police put the Coroner up to calling Mrs. Saumarez as a witness. They'd got a theory that Wellesley killed your cousin in a fit of jealousy, of which she was the cause, and they hoped to substantiate it through her evidence. There's no doubt, sir, that there were love passages between Dr. Wellesley and this attractive lady, and between her and your cousin, but shall I tell you, sir, something that's in my mind?" "Ay, why not?" answered Brent. He was thinking of the thick pile of letters which he had returned to Mrs. Saumarez, and of the unmistakable love tokens which he had seen deposited with them in the casket wherein Wallingford had kept them. "What is it you're thinking of?" Peppermore edged his chair closer to his visitor's and lowered his voice. "I am not unobservant, Mr. Brent," he said. "Our profession, as you know, sir, leads us to the cultivation of that faculty. Now, I've thought a good deal about this matter, and I'll tell you a conclusion I've come to. Do you remember that when Dr. Wellesley was being questioned the other day, he was asked if there was jealousy between him and Mr. Wallingford about Mrs. Saumarez? To be sure. Now, what did he answer? He answered frankly that there had been, but it no longer existed. Do you know what I deduced from that, Mr. Brent? This, that the little lady had had both those men as strings to her bow at the same time, indecisive as to which of 'em she'd finally choose, but that, not so long since, she'd given up both in favour of a third man." "Ingenious, Peppermore, very ingenious," he said. "Given 'em both the mitten, as they say? But the third man?" "Mrs. Saumarez was away on the Continent most of the winter," answered Peppermore. "The Riviera, Nice, Monte Carlo, that sort of thing. She may have met somebody there that she preferred to either Wellesley or Wallingford. Anyway, Mr. Brent, what did the doctor mean when he frankly admitted that there had been jealousy between him and Wallingford, but that it no longer existed? He meant, I take it, that there was no reason for its further existence. That implies that another man had come into the arena." "Ay, but does it?" said Brent. "It might mean something else that she'd finally accepted Wellesley, eh?" "No," declared Peppermore. "She's not engaged to Wellesley. I'll lay anything she isn't, Mr. Brent. There's a third man, somewhere in the background, and it's my opinion that that's the reason why she doesn't want the publicity she came to me about." Brent fell into a new train of thought, more or less confused. Mrs. Saumarez's talk to him about Wallingford and the letters and the things in the casket were all mixed up in it. "Had you any opportunity of seeing Wellesley and my cousin together during the last week or two before my cousin's death?" he asked presently. "Several, Mr. Brent, several opportunities," answered Peppermore. "I went to report the proceedings of 2 or 3 committees of the Town Council during the fortnight preceding that lamentable occurrence, sir, and saw them at close quarters. I saw them frequently at the club of which I am a member. I should say, sir, from what I observed, that they were on very good terms with each other, more friendly than ever, Mr. Brent." Said Brent. "Well, there's a lot of queer stuff about this business, Peppermore, but let's get back to that of the moment. Look here, I've got a fine notion for your Monitor. You'll just have time to get it out before my election day. Let's make a real, vigorous, uncompromising attack on the principle of the Town Trustee business. We'll not say one word about the present trustees, old Crood, Mallett and Coppinger. We'll have no personalities and make up no charges. We'll avoid all stuff of that sort. We'll just attack the thing on its principle, taking up the line that it's a bad principle that the finances of a borough should be entrusted to the sole control of three men responsible to nobody, and with the power, if one dies, to elect his successor. Let's argue it out on the principle. Then, later, we'll have another article on the argument that the finances of a town should be wholly controlled by the elected representatives of the people. See?" "Your late cousin's theories, Mr. Brent," said Peppermore. "Excellent notions, both, sir. You write the articles, I'll find the space. All on principle, no personalities. Plain and practical, Mr. Brent, let them be, so that everybody can understand. Though, to be sure," he added regretfully, "what our readers most like is personalities. If we dared to slate old Crood with all the abuse we could lay our pens to, the readers of the Monitor, sir, would hug themselves with pleasure. But libel, Mr. Brent, libel! Do you know, sir, that ever since I occupied the editorial chair of State, I have always felt that the wet blanket of the law of libel sat at my banquet like the ghost in Macbeth, letting its sword hang by a thread an inch from my cranium. Bit mixed in my metaphors, sir, but you know what I mean. Mustn't involve my respected proprietor in a libel suit, Mr. Brent, so stick to abstract principles, sir, and eschew those saucy personal touches which, I regret deeply, I can't print." Brent had no intention of indulging in personalities in his warfare with Simon Crood and the reactionaries, but as the day of the election approached he discovered that his adversaries were not at all particular about putting forth highly personal references to himself. Hathelsborough suddenly became flooded with handbills and posters, each bearing a few pithy words in enormous type. These effusions were for the most part in the form of questions, addressed to the recipients. There was a cynical and sinister sneer in all of them. Who is Mr. Brent? Why support a stranger? Who wants a carpetbagger? Vote for the home-made article. Hathelsborough men for Hathelsborough matters. Stand by the true and tried. These appeals to the free and enlightened burgesses whose suffrages he solicited met Brent on every side, and especially on the day of the election. He had gone in for nothing of this sort himself. His original election address, it seemed to him, contained everything that he had to say, and beyond posting it all over the town in great placards and distributing it in the form of handbills to the electors of the Castle Ward, he had issued nothing in the shape of literature. But he had stumped his desired constituency thoroughly, making speeches at every street corner and at every public meeting place, and he had a personal conviction from his usual reception on these occasions that the people were with him. He was still sure of victory when, at noon on the polling day, he chanced to meet Tansley. "Going strong, as far as I can make out," he answered, in response to the solicitor's inquiry. "I've been about all the morning, and from what I've seen and what my committee tell me, I'm in." Tansley shook his head. "Look here, my lad," he said, drawing Brent aside, as they stood together in the market-place, "don't you build too high. They're working against you to-day, the Crood gang, as they never worked in their lives. They're bringing every influence they can get hold of against you. And you haven't been over-wise." "What have I done now?" demanded Brent. "Those articles that are appearing in the Monitor," replied Tansley. "Everybody knows they're yours. Do you think there's a soul in Hathelsborough who believes that Peppermore could write them? Now, they're a mistake. They may be true." "They are true," growled Brent. "Granted. But however true they are, they're an attack on Hathelsborough," said Tansley. "Now, of whatever political colour they are, Hathelsborough folk are Hathelsborough folk, and they're prouder of this old town than you know. Look round you, my lad. There isn't a stone that you can see that wasn't just where it is now hundreds of years before you were born. Do you think these people like to hear you, a stranger, criticising their old customs, old privileges, as you are doing in those articles? Not a bit of it. They're asking who you are to come judging them. You'd have done a lot better, Brent, if you'd been a bit diplomatic. You should have left all politics and reforms out of it, and tried to win the seat simply on your relationship to Wallingford. You could have shown your cards when you got in. You've shown 'em too soon." "That be damned," said Brent. "I've played the game straightforwardly anyhow. I don't want any underhand business. There's enough of that in this rotten place now. And I still think I shall be in." But before the summer evening had progressed far, Brent learned that the vested interests of an ancient English borough are stronger than he thought. He was hopelessly defeated. Only rather more than 100 voters marked their papers for him. His opponent was returned by a big majority. He got a new idea when he heard the result, and went straight off to Peppermore and the Monitor with it. They would go on with the articles, and make them of such a nature that the Local Government Board in London would find it absolutely necessary to give prompt and searching attention to Hathelsborough and its affairs. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Loose strands. By business time next morning, Brent had cast aside all thought of the previous day's proceedings and of his defeat at the hands of the old gang, and had turned to affairs which were now of far more importance. He had 3 separate enterprises in hand. To be sure, they were all related, but each had a distinctive character of its own. He specified all 3 as he ate his breakfast at the Chancellor, where he was still located. First, now that he had done with his electioneering, for the time being, he was going to work harder than ever at the task of discovering Wallingford's murderer. Secondly, he was going to marry Queenie, and that speedily. Queenie and he had settled matters to their mutual satisfaction as soon as the row with Uncle Simon Crood was over, and they had already begun furnishing the house which Brent had bought in order to constitute himself a full-fledged burgess of Hathelsborough. Thirdly, he was going to put all he knew into the articles which he was writing for the Monitor. 2 had already appeared. He was going on writing them until public opinion, gradually educated, became too strong for the reactionary forces that had beaten him yesterday, but which he would infallibly defeat tomorrow, or, if not tomorrow, the day after. And first, the murderer. He fetched Queenie from Mrs. Appleyard's that morning, and, utterly careless of the sly looks that were cast on him and her, marched her through the market-place to Hawthwaite's office at the police station. To Hawthwaite, keenly interested, he detailed particulars of Queenie's discovery about the typewritten letter and produced her proofs. Hawthwaite took it all in silently. "You'll have to go into that, you know," concluded Brent. "Now that I've got through with that election, I'm going to give more time to this business. We've got to find out who killed my cousin, Hawthwaite, somehow. It's not going to rest. I won't leave a stone unturned. And there," he added, pointing to the sheet of paper on which Queenie had made specimens of the broken type of Simon's antiquated machine, "is a stone which needs examining on all 4 sides." Hawthwaite picked up the sheet of paper, twisted it in his big fingers, and looked over it at the 2 young people with a quizzical smile. "I understand that you and Miss Queenie there are contemplating matrimony, Mr. Brent?" he remarked. "That so, sir?" "That's so," replied Brent promptly. "As soon as we've got our house furnished, we'll be married." "Then I can speak freely and in confidence before Mrs. Brent that's to be," responded Hawthwaite with another smile. "Well, now, what you've just told me isn't exactly fresh news to me. I'll show you something." He turned, drew out a drawer from a chest behind his chair, and finding a paper in it, took it out and handed it to his visitors. "Look at that, now," he said. "You see what it is?" Brent saw at once. It was a half sheet of notepaper on which were examples of faulty type precisely similar to those on Queenie's bit of evidence. "Hullo!" exclaimed Brent. "Somebody else been at the same game, eh?" "I'll tell you," answered Hawthwaite, settling himself in his chair. "It's a bit since let us think now yes, it would be a day or two after that facsimile appeared in the Monitor that a young man came to me here one evening respectable, artisan sort of chap. He told me that he was in the employ of a typewriter company at Clothford, which, Mr. Brent, as Miss Queenie there knows, is our big town, only a few miles away. He said that he'd come to tell me something in confidence. The previous day, he said, Mr. Crood, of Hathelsborough, had come to their place in Clothford, and had brought with him an old-fashioned typewriter, which, he told them, he had bought when such things first came out. He wanted to know the thing, being, he said, an old favourite. If they couldn't do it up for him, go through its mechanism thoroughly, supply new letters, and so on. They said that they could. He left it to be done, and it was handed over to this young man. Now then, this young man, my informant, has some relations here in Hathelsborough. A day or so before Simon Crood called with his machine, they sent him, the young man, a copy of the Monitor with this facsimile letter enclosed. Being concerned with such things in his trade, he was naturally interested in the facsimile, and of course, as an expert, he noticed the broken letters. However, he didn't connect the facsimile with Crood's machine at first, but happening to look at that machine more narrowly, to see exactly what had to be done to it, he, as he phrased it, ran off the keys on a sheet of paper, and he then saw at once that he had before him the identical machine on which the threatening letter to our late Mayor had been typed, and so he came to me. "And what have you done about it?" asked Brent. Hawthwaite gave him a knowing look. "Well, I'll tell you that too," he answered. "I've got the machine. It's there, in that box in the corner. The Clothford firm will make an excuse to Mr. Crood that they've had to send this machine away for repairs, eh? Of course, I'm not going to let it out of my possession until until we know more." "There's no doubt he wrote that threatening letter," observed Brent. "Oh, no doubt whatever," agreed Hawthwaite. "What about that handkerchief and the inquiry at the laundry?" asked Brent. Hawthwaite accompanied his reply with a nod and a wink. "That's being followed up," he said. "Don't ask me any more now. We're progressing, and I believe in the right direction this time. Do you leave it to us, Mr. Brent. You'll be surprised before long, and so will some other folks. You go on with those articles you've started in the Monitor. It doesn't do for me to say much, being an official," he added, with another wink. "But you'll do some good in that way. There's a lot under the surface in this old town, sir, that only needs exposing to the light of day to ensure destruction. Public opinion, Mr. Brent, public opinion. You stir it up and leave this matter to me. I may be slow, Mr. Brent, but I'll surely get there in the end." "Good. It's all I ask," said Brent. "Only get there." He took Queenie away, but before they had gone many steps from the superintendent's office, Hawthwaite called Brent back, and leading him inside the room, closed the door on him. "Your young lady'll not mind waiting a minute or two," he said, with a significant glance. "As she already knew about old Simon's typewriter, I didn't mind telling that I knew, d'ye see? But there's another little matter that I'd like to tell you about, between ourselves and to go no further. You understand?" "Just so," agreed Brent. "Well," continued Hawthwaite, "there may be nothing in it, but I've always had a suspicion that there was nothing definite got out of either Dr. Wellesley or Mrs. Saumarez about their I won't say love affairs, but relations. Anyway, that there was something mysterious about the sort of three-cornered relations between her and Wellesley and your cousin, I'm as dead certain as that I see you. I've an idea that somehow or other those relations have something to do with your cousin's murder. But now, this is it, you know, I dare say, that at the back of Mrs. Saumarez's garden at the Abbey House there's a quiet, narrow lane, little used?" "I know it," replied Brent. "Farthing Lane." "Just so. And why so called, none of our local antiquaries know," said Hawthwaite. "Well, not so many nights ago I had some business in that lane at a late hour. I was watching for somebody, as a matter of fact, though it came to nothing. I was in a secret place, just as it was getting nicely dark. Now then, who should come along that lane but Krevin Crood!" "Krevin Crood!" exclaimed Brent. "Aye?" "Krevin Crood," repeated Hawthwaite. "And, thinks I to myself, what may you be doing here, my lad, at this hour of the night? For, as you know that lane, Mr. Brent, you'll know that on one side of it there's nothing but the long wall of Mrs. Saumarez's garden and grounds, and on the other a belt of trees that shuts off Robinson's market garden and orchards. I was safe hidden amongst those trees. Well, Krevin came along. I recognized him well enough. He sort of loitered about, evidently waiting for somebody. And just as the parish church clock struck 10, I heard the click of a latch, and the door in Mrs. Saumarez's back garden opened, and a woman came out. I knew her, too." "Not Mrs. Saumarez?" suggested Brent. "No," replied Hawthwaite. "Not Mrs. Saumarez. But that companion of hers, Mrs. Elstrick. Tall, thin, very reserved woman. You may have noticed that she goes about the town very quietly never talks to anybody." "I've scarcely noticed her, except when she was here in court with Mrs. Saumarez," replied Brent. "But I know the woman you mean. So it was she?" "Just so Mrs. Elstrick," said Hawthwaite. "And I saw, of course, that this was a put up job, an arranged meeting between her and Krevin. They met, turned, walked up and down the lane together for a good 10 minutes, talking in whispers. They passed and repassed me several times, and I'd have given a good deal to hear what they were talking about. But I couldn't catch a word. They were on the opposite side of the lane, you see, close to the garden wall." "And eventually?" asked Brent. "Oh, eventually they parted, of course," replied Hawthwaite. "She slipped back into the garden, and he went off down the lane. Now " "They're both tending to elderliness, I think," interrupted Brent, with a cynical laugh. "But one's never surprised at anything nowadays. So, did you see any love making?" "Oh, Lord save us, no!" exclaimed Hawthwaite. "Nothing of that sort. They never even shook hands. Just talked, and very earnestly, too." Brent reflected for a while. "Queer!" he said at last. "What did they want with each other?" "Aye," said Hawthwaite. "As I said just now, I'd have given a good deal to know. But Krevin Crood is a deep, designing, secret sort of man, and that woman, whoever she may be, looks just the same." "Has she been with Mrs. Saumarez long?" asked Brent. "Came with her when Mrs. Saumarez first came and took the Abbey House," replied Hawthwaite. "Always been with her. Went away with her when Mrs. S. was in the south of France all last winter. Odd couple, I call the two of 'em, Mr. Brent, between you and myself." "Why, exactly?" inquired Brent. "I've seen nothing particularly odd about Mrs. Saumarez, except that she's evidently a highly strung, perhaps a bit excitable sort of woman, all nerves, I should say, and possibly a bit emotional. Clever woman, I think, and pretty." "Pretty enough and clever enough," assented Hawthwaite dryly. "And I dare say you're right about the rest. But I'll tell you why I used that term, at least in regard to her. When Mrs. Saumarez first came here, it was understood that she was the widow of a naval officer of high rank. Well, naturally, the big folk of the neighbourhood called on her when she'd settled down. She furnished and fitted her house from local shops, and it took her some time to get fixed up, expecting, of course, that she'd return their calls. She never returned a single one. Not one, sir." "That certainly sounds odd," admitted Brent. "Aye, doesn't it?" said Hawthwaite. "You'd have thought that a young and stylish woman, coming to live here as she did, would have been glad of society. But though some dozen or so ladies of the place called on her, she never, as I say, returned a single call. In fact, it very soon became evident that she didn't want any society of that sort. She used to go out bicycling a good deal by herself in those early days. That, I fancy, was how she got to know both Wellesley and your cousin. She was fond enough of their society, anyway." "Always?" asked Brent. He was learning things that he had never heard of, and was already thinking deeply about them. "From the beginning?" "Well, practically," replied Hawthwaite. "First it was the doctor, then it was Wallingford. And," he added with a wink, "there are folk in the town who declare that she carried on with both, playing one off against the other till the very end. I don't know how that may be, but I do know that at one time she and Wellesley were very thick, and that afterwards your cousin was always running after her. Naturally there was talk, especially amongst the folk who called on her and whose calls she didn't return. And, to tell you the plain truth, they said things." "What sort of things?" inquired Brent. "Oh, well," said Hawthwaite with a laugh, "if you'd lived as long in this town as I have and been in my position, you'd know that it, like all little places, is a hotbed of scandal and gossip. The women, of course, seeing her partiality for men friends, said things and hinted more. Then the vicar's wife parsons' ladies are great ones for talk found something out and made the most of it. I told you that when Mrs. Saumarez first came here, it was understood that she was the widow of an officer of some high position in the Royal Navy. Well, our vicar's wife has a brother who's a big man in that profession, and she was a bit curious to know about the newcomer's relation to it. She persisted in calling on Mrs. Saumarez, though her calls weren't returned. She could make excuses, you see, about parish matters and charities and what not. And one day she asked Mrs. Saumarez point blank what ship her late husband had served on. Now, she says that Mrs. Saumarez snapped her up short anyway. Mrs. S. gave her an answer. My late husband, said Mrs. S., was not in the British service. And of course that wasn't in her favour with the people whom she'd already snubbed. Said Brent. There were many things in this retailing of gossip that he wanted to think about at leisure. Well, he added after a pause, I dare say all sorts of small items help towards a solution, Hawthwaite, but you're already busy about it. I'm not only busy, but actively so, replied the superintendent. And between you and me and nobody else, I'm expecting some very special professional and expert assistance within the next few days. Oh, you leave this to me, Mr. Brent. I'll run down your cousin's murderer, or murderess yet. Go you on with your articles. They're helpful, for they're rousing public interest. Brent went away and followed Hawthwaite's advice. His articles came out in the Monitor twice a week. Peppermore printed them in big type, leaded, and gave them the most prominent place in the paper. He himself was as proud of these uncompromising attacks on the municipal government of Hathelsborough as if he had written them himself. The proprietor of the Monitor was placidly agreeable about them, for the simple reason that after the first two had appeared the circulation of his journal doubled, and after the next three was at least 4 times what it had ever been before. Everybody in their immediate neighbourhood read and discussed the articles. Extracts from them were given in the county papers. Some of the London dailies began to lift them. Eventually, a local member of Parliament asked a question about them in the House of Commons, and one day Peppermore came rushing to Brent in a state of high excitement. "The pen is mightier than the sword, Mr. Brent, sir, that's a fact!" he gasped, tumbling headlong into Brent's room. "Heard the news, sir, all through your articles." "Heard nothing," replied Brent. "What is it?" "I had it from the Town Clerk just now, so it's gospel truth," replied Peppermore. "The Local Government Board, sir, is, at last, moved to action. It's going to send down an inspector, a real, full-fledged inspector. The Town Clerk is in a worse state of righteous indignation than I ever saw a man, and as for Mayor Simon Crood, I understand his anger is beyond belief. Mr. Brent, you've done it." But Brent was not so sure. He had some experience of Government officials and of official methods, and knew more of red tape than Peppermore did. As for Tansley, who came in soon after, he was cynically scornful. "Local Government Board Inspector!" he exclaimed scoffingly. "Pooh! Some old fossil who'll come here I'll tell you how. He'll ask for the responsible authorities that's Simon Crood and Company. He'll hear all they've got to say they'll say what they like. He'll examine their documents the documents will be all ready for him. Everything will be nice and proper and in strict order, and every man will say precisely what he's been ordered to say, and there you are. The inspector will issue his report that he's carefully examined everything and found all correct, and the comedy will conclude with the farce of votes of thanks all round. That's the line, Brent." "Maybe," said Brent, "and only maybe." "You're in a pessimistic vein, Mr. Tansley, sir," declared Peppermore. "Sir, we're going to clean out the Augean stable." "Or perish in the attempt, eh, Peppermore?" retorted Tansley good-humouredly. "All right, my lad, but it'll take a lot more than Monitor articles and Local Government Board inquiries to uproot the ancient and time-honoured customs of Hathelsborough. Semper eadem, Peppermore, semper eadem. That's the motto of this high-principled, respectably ruled borough. Always the same, and no change." "Except from bad to worse," said Peppermore. "All right, sir, but something's going to happen this time." Something did happen immediately following on the official announcement of the Local Government Board inquiry, and it was Tansley who told Brent of it. "I say," he said, coming up to Brent in the street, "here's a queer business. I don't know if you've heard of it. Mrs. Mallett's run away from her husband. Fact! She cleared clean out, and let it be known, too. Odd! Mystery seemed to be increasing, Brent. What do you make of it?" Brent could make nothing of it. There might be many reasons why Mrs. Mallett should leave her husband. But had this sudden retreat anything to do with Mrs. Mallett's evidence at the inquest? He was speculating on this when he got a request from Hawthwaite to go round at once to his office. He responded immediately to find the superintendent closeted with Dr. Wellesley. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Black Secrets and Red Tape. Before ever Brent dropped into the chair to which Hawthwaite silently pointed him, he knew that he was about to hear revelations. He was conscious of an atmosphere in that drab, sombre little room. Hawthwaite's glance at him as he entered was that of a man who bids another to prepare himself for news. Wellesley looked unusually stern and perplexed. "Dr. Wellesley got me to send for you, Mr. Brent," said the superintendent. "He's got something to tell which he thinks you, as next of kin to our late Mayor, ought to know." Brent nodded and turned in silence to Wellesley. Wellesley, who had been staring moodily at the fireless grate, looked up, glancing from one man to the other. "You understand, Mr. Brent, and you, Hawthwaite, that whatever I tell you is told in the very strictest confidence?" he said. "As you say, Hawthwaite, I think it's something that you ought to know, both of you, but at present I don't know if there's anything in it. I mean anything that has real, practical relation to Wallingford's death, or not. I am to speak in confidence?" "To me, yes," answered Brent promptly. "It'll not go beyond me, Doctor," said Hawthwaite with a smile. "I'm used to this job. Heard more secrets and private communications in my time than I can remember. I've clean forgotten most of them." "Very well," agreed Wellesley. "This is strictly private, then, at present. Now, to begin with, I suppose you have both heard it's pretty well known through the town, I understand that Mrs. Mallett has left her husband?" "Aye," replied Hawthwaite. "I've heard that." "Yes," said Brent. "I, too." "I dare say you both gathered from the evidence of mine and of Mrs. Mallett's at the adjourned inquest that there was some mystery underlying her visit to me?" continued Wellesley. "Some secret, eh?" "Couldn't very well gather anything else, Doctor," replied Hawthwaite. "Evident!" "The fact of the case is," said Wellesley suddenly, "that wasn't the first visit Mrs. Mallett had paid to me and to Wallingford in that way. She'd been twice before during that week. On the first occasion she only saw me; on the second she and I saw Wallingford together in the Mayor's Parlour. On the third, the one we gave evidence about, she went to see Wallingford alone, but, as she told you, she found he was engaged and came away." The three men looked at each other. Hawthwaite voiced what two of the three were wondering. "Some business which concerned all three of you, then, doctor?" he suggested. "Business which deeply concerned her, and on which she came to consult me and Wallingford," replied Wellesley. "Now I'll tell you straight out what it was. Mrs. Mallett had found out that there was some sort of an intrigue between her husband and Mrs. Saumarez." For a moment a deep silence fell over the room. Brent felt his brows drawing together in a frown, the sort of frown that spreads over a man's face when he tries to think quickly and clearly over a problem unexpectedly presented to him. Hawthwaite folded his arms across his braided tunic, stared at the ceiling, and whistled softly. He was the first to speak. "Uh-oh!" he said. So that's But she'd have some proof, doctor, for an assertion of that sort? Not mere guesswork?" "I'm afraid there's no guesswork about it," said Wellesley. "It's not a pleasant matter to discuss, but that's unavoidable now. This is what Mrs. Mallett told Wallingford and myself. Mrs. Mallett, as you know, is a downright, plain-spoken woman, with strong views of her own, and she's just the sort to go through with the thing. Some little time ago she found, evidently through Mallett's carelessness, a receipt for a very valuable diamond ring from a London jeweller, a lady's ring. This, of course, aroused her suspicions, and without saying anything to her husband, she determined to have his movements watched. She knew that Mallett was frequently going away for a day at a time, ostensibly on business connected with the bank, and she employed a private inquiry agent to watch him. This man followed Mallett from Hathelsborough to Clothford one morning, and from Clothford station to the Royal County Hotel, where, in the lounge, he was joined by Mrs. Saumarez, who had been previously pointed out to the agent here in Hathelsborough, and who had evidently cycled over to Clothford. She and Mallett lunched at the Royal County in a private room, and spent the greater part of the afternoon there. The same thing occurred on 2 other occasions. So then Mrs. Mallett came to me and to Wallingford." "Why to you?" demanded Brent. "I think," replied Wellesley, with a forced smile, "she may have had a womanish feeling of revenge, knowing that Wallingford and myself had, well, both paid a good deal of attention to Mrs. Saumarez. But there were other reasons. Mrs. Mallett has few friends in the town. I was her medical attendant, and she and Wallingford frequently met each other on 1 or 2 committees. Mrs. Mallett took a good deal of interest in social affairs. Anyway, she came and confided in us about this." "I suppose you and Wallingford discussed it?" suggested Brent. "Yes," replied Wellesley. "Briefly, on the night before his death." "Was that the reason of your saying at the inquest that there was no jealousy between you at the time of his death, as regards Mrs. Saumarez?" "Just so. There couldn't be any jealousy, could there, after what we'd heard?" "You believed this, then?" "We couldn't do anything else. The man whom Mrs. Mallett employed is a thoroughly dependable man. There's not the slightest doubt that Mrs. Saumarez secretly met Mallett and spent most of the afternoon with him, under the circumstances I mentioned, on 3 separate occasions." "And that's the reason of Mrs. Mallett's sudden flight, if you call it so, is it, doctor?" asked Hawthwaite, who had been listening intently. "That's the reason, yes," replied Wellesley. "What's she going to do?" inquired Hawthwaite. "Divorce?" "She said something about a legal separation," answered Wellesley. "I suppose it will come to the other thing." "And how do you think this is related to Wallingford's murder?" asked Hawthwaite with sudden directness. "Let's be plain, doctor. Do you suspect Mallett?" Wellesley showed signs of indecision. "I don't like to say that I do," he replied at last. "And yet I don't know. I've rather wondered if there'd been any meeting between Mallett and Wallingford after Wallingford knew about this. I believe they did meet, on business, during the day. Now, to tell you the truth, Wallingford was much more shall we say upset? About this affair than I was. He was very much gone on Mrs. Saumarez. It struck me that he may have threatened Mallett with exposure. And exposure, of course, would mean a great deal to a man in Mallett's position, a bank manager and town trustee, and so on. But I really don't know what to think." "There's a thing I'd like to know," said Brent. "What do you think about the woman in the case? You've had chances of knowing her." Wellesley gave his questioner a searching look. "I would rather not say, Mr. Brent," he replied. "Discoveries of this sort, substantiated, are well, disconcerting. Besides, they tend to a revision of opinion. They're sidelights unfortunate ones." "Look here," said Brent, "were you greatly surprised?" "Well, looking back," responded Wellesley thoughtfully, "perhaps not greatly. I think she's a bit of a mystery." Brent turned to Hawthwaite. Hawthwaite, however, looked at the doctor. "Well, doctor," he said, "I think you've done right to tell this. There's something in the suggestion that there may have been a fatal quarrel between Mallett and Wallingford. But I don't want to go into this at present. I'm full up otherwise. Leave it until this Local Government Board inspection is over." "Why until then?" asked Wellesley. "Why, because for anything we know to the contrary, something may come out at that which will dovetail into this," replied Hawthwaite. "The inspector is coming down at once. We'll leave this over till he's been. Look here, has Mrs. Mallett let this out to anybody but you?" "No, I'm sure of that," answered Wellesley. "It's been known in the town for some time common knowledge that she and Mallett weren't on good terms. But she assured me just before leaving that she hasn't mentioned the episodes I've detailed to any other person here than myself and, of course, Wallingford." "And he's gone, poor fellow," said Hawthwaite. "And Mr. Brent and myself will be secret as to the grave he lies in. All right, doctor. Just leave it to me." When Wellesley had gone away, Hawthwaite turned to Brent. "I don't believe for one moment that Mallett murdered your cousin," he said. "I'm not surprised about this other affair, but I don't think it's anything to do with what we're after. No, that's on a side track. But I'll tell you what, Mr. Brent, I shouldn't be astonished if I found out that Mallett knows who the murderer is." "I wish you'd tell me if you've any idea yourself who the murderer is!" exclaimed Brent. "I'm wearying to get at something concrete." "Well, if you must have it, I have an idea," answered the superintendent. "It's a strong idea, too. I'm working at it. To tell you the truth, though nobody knows it but one or two of my trusted men, I've had a very clever man down from New Scotland Yard for the past fortnight. He went away yesterday, and he was of great assistance in unearthing certain facts. And I'm only waiting now for some expert evidence on a very important point which I can't get until next week, in order to make a move. As soon as ever this Local Government Board inspection's over, I'll make that move. And how do you think that inspection will turn out, Mr. Brent?" "Don't know, can't say, no idea," replied Brent. "Nor have I," remarked Hawthwaite. "Candidly, I never expect much help from so-called public inquiries. There's too much officialism about 'em. Still, every little bit helps." These conversations, and the revelations which had transpired during their course, led Brent into a new train of thought. He had been well aware, ever since his coming to Hathelsborough, of an atmosphere of intrigue and mystery; every development that occurred seemed to thicken it. Here again was more intrigue, centring in a domestic imbroglio. There was nothing much to be wondered at in it, he thought. Mallett was the sort of man to attract a certain type of woman, and from all Brent had heard in the town, a man given to adventure. Mrs. Saumarez was clearly a woman fond of men's society. Mrs. Mallett, on the other hand, was a straight-laced, hard sort, given to social work and the furtherance of movements in which her husband took no interest. The sequence of events seemed probable to Brent. First there had been Wellesley, then Wallingford, perhaps a cleverly contrived double affair with both. But during a recent period there had been this affair with Mallett, that from Wellesley's showing had come to Wallingford's ears. Brent knew his cousin sufficiently well to know that Wallingford would develop an ugly frame of mind on finding that he had been deceived. All sorts of things might well develop out of a sudden discovery. But had all this anything to do with Wallingford's murder? That, after all, was to him the main point. And so far he saw no obvious connection. He felt like a man who is presented with a mass of tangled cord, from which protrude a dozen loose ends. Which end to seize upon that, on being drawn out, would not reveal more knots and tangles, he did not know, for the very life of him. Perhaps, as Hawthwaite had remarked, it all helped, but as far as Brent could see, it was still difficult to lay hold of a continuous and unbroken line. It puzzled him, being still a stranger to the habits and customs of these people, to see that life in Hathelsborough went on, amidst all these alarums and excursions, very much as usual. He had already cultivated a habit of frequenting places of public resort, such as the smoking room of his hotel, the big bar room at Bull's, the rooms of the Town Club, to which he had without difficulty been duly elected a member on Tansley's nomination. At all these places he heard a great deal of gossip, but found no surprise shown at its subjects. Within a day or two, everybody who frequented these places knew that there had been a domestic upheaval at Mallett's, and had at least some idea of the true reason for it. But nobody showed any astonishment; everybody, indeed, seemed to take it as a matter of course. Evidently it made no difference to Mallett himself, who was seen about the town just as usual, in his accustomed haunts; and when Brent remarked on this seeming indifference to Epplewhite, whom he sometimes conversed with at the club, Epplewhite only laughed. "If you knew this town and its people as well as I do, Mr. Brent," he said, "you'd know that things of this sort are viewed in a light that outsiders, perhaps, wouldn't view them in. The underhand affairs, the intrigues, the secret goings-on that exist here are multitudinous. Hathelsborough folk have a fixed standard: do what you like as long as you don't get found out. Understand, sir?" "But in this case the thing seems to have been found out," remarked Brent. "That, in the Hathelsborough mental economy, is the only mistake in it," replied Epplewhite dryly. "It's the only thing that Mallett will get blamed for. Lord bless you, do you think he's the only man in the place that's had such an affair? But Hathelsborough folk, men and women, are past masters and mistresses at secrecy and deception. If you could take the top off this town and look deep down under it, there would be something to see. But, as I dare say you're beginning to find out, that's no easy job." "Will the top be lifted at this Local Government Board inspection?" asked Brent. Epplewhite shook his head. "I doubt it, sir," he answered. "I doubt it very much. I've seen a bit too much of officialism, Mr. Brent, to cherish any hopes of it. I'll tell you what'll probably happen when this inspector comes. To start with, he's bound to be more or less in the hands of the officials. We know who they are, the 3 Town Trustees and the staff under them. Do you think they won't prepare their books and documents in such a fashion as to ensure getting a report in their favour? Of course! And what's to stop it? Who's to interfere?" "I suppose he will hear both sides of the question," suggested Brent. "Who is there to put the other side of the question except on broad lines, such as you've taken up in your Monitor articles?" asked Epplewhite. "True, the inspector can ask for information and for criticism, and for any facts bearing on the subject. But who'll come forward to give it? Can I? Can Wellesley? Can any of our party? Not one, in any satisfactory fashion. We've nothing but impressions and suspicions to go on. We haven't access to the books and papers. The only man who could have done something was your cousin, our late Mayor, and he's gone. And talking about that, Mr. Brent, there's a matter that I've been thinking a good deal about lately, and I think it should be put to Hawthwaite. You know, of course, that your cousin and I were very friendly. That came out in my evidence when the inquest was first opened. Well, he used to tell me things about his investigation of these Corporation finances, and I happen to know that he kept his notes and figures about them in a certain memorandum book, a thickish one, with a stout red leather cover, which he always carried about with him. He'd have it on him, or on his desk in the Mayor's Parlour when he met his death, I'm certain. Now then, where is that book?" "That's highly important," said Brent. "I never heard of it. It certainly wasn't on him, and it wasn't on the desk, for I examined that myself in company with the police." "Well, he had such a book, and search should be made for it," remarked Epplewhite. "If it could have been produced at this inquiry, some good might have come of it. But as things are, I see little hope of any change. Vested interests and old customs aren't upset in a day, Mr. Brent." and Brent was soon to discover that both Tansley and Epplewhite were correct in their prophecies about the investigation which he himself had so strenuously advocated in his articles. The local Government Board inspector came. He sat in the Moot Hall for 2 days, in public. He examined the ancient charters and deeds. He questioned the town trustees. He went through the books. He invited criticism and objections, and got nothing but a general statement of the policy of the reforming party from Epplewhite as its leader. That party, said Epplewhite, objected to the old constitution as being outworn, and wished for a more modern arrangement. Finally, the inspector, referring to the articles in the Monitor which had led to the holding of the inquiry, expressed a wish to see and question their writer. Brent stood up in the midst of a crowded court and confessed himself sole author of the articles in question. "Why did you write them?" inquired the inspector. "From a sense of public duty," replied Brent. "But I understand that you are a stranger, or a comparative stranger, to the town?" suggested the inspector. "I am a burgess, a resident and a property owner in the town. I took up this work, which I mean to see right through, in succession to my cousin, John Wallingford, late Mayor of this borough, who was murdered in this very hall," said Brent. "There are men here who know that he was working day and night to bring about the financial reforms which I advocate." The inspector moved uneasily in his seat at the sound of the word which Brent emphasized in reference to his cousin. "I am sure I sympathize with you, Mr. Brent," he said. "I have been much grieved to hear of the late Mayor's sad fate. But you say you have voluntarily taken up his work? Did he leave you any facts, figures, statistics, particulars to work on?" "If he had known that I was going to take up his work, he would doubtless have left me plenty," replied Brent. "But he was murdered. He had such things a certain notebook filled with his discoveries." "Where is that book?" inquired the inspector. "Can it be produced?" "It cannot," said Brent. "It was stolen when my cousin was killed." The inspector hesitated, shuffling his papers. "Then you have no figures, facts, anything, Mr. Brent?" he said presently. "Nothing to support your newspaper articles?" "Nothing of that sort," answered Brent. "My articles refer wholly to the general principle of the thing." The inspector smiled. "I'm afraid governments, national or municipal, aren't run on general principles, Mr. Brent," he remarked. "No," said Brent. "They seem to be run on the lack of them." The official inquiry came to an end on that, amidst good-humoured laughter at Brent's apparently ingenuous retort. The inspector announced that he would issue his report in due course, and everybody knew what it would be. The good old ways, the time-honoured customs would have another lease of life. Once more Simon Crood had come out on top. But as he was leaving the Moot Hall, Brent felt his arm touched, and turned to see Hawthwaite. The superintendent gave him a knowing look. "To-morrow," he whispered. "Be prepared. All's done. All's ready." Chapter 20 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Fell Hand. Brent heard what the superintendent said, nodded a silent reply, and 5 minutes later had put that particular thing clean out of his mind. During the progress of the Local Government Board inquiry he had learned something: that men like Tansley and Epplewhite knew a lot more about Hathelsborough and Hathelsborough folk than he did, or that Wallingford had known, despite the murdered man's longer experience of town and people. Reform was not going to be carried out in a day in that time-worn borough, nor were its ancient customs, rotten and corrupt as they were, to be uprooted by newspaper articles. So far, Simon Crood and his gang had won all along the line, and Brent realized that most men in his position would have given up the contest and retired from the field in weariness and disgust. But he was not going to give up, nor to retire. He had a feeling, amounting to something near akin to a superstition, that it was his sacred duty to carry on his dead cousin's work, especially as Wallingford, by leaving him all his money, had provided him with the means of doing it. There in Hathelsborough he was, and in Hathelsborough he would stick, holding on like a bulldog to the enemy. "I'm not counted out," he said that evening, talking the proceedings of the day over with Queenie. "I'm up again and ready for the next round. Here I am, and here I stop. But new tactics permeation, that's the ticket. Reckon I'll nitrate and percolate the waters of pure truth into these people in such a fashion that they'll come to see that what that old uncle of yours and his precious satellites have been giving 'em was nothing but a very muddy mixture. Permeation, that's the game in future." Queenie scarcely knew what he meant, but she gathered a sense of it from the set of his square jaw and the flash of his grey eyes. Being increasingly in love with him, it was incomprehensible to her that anybody could beat Brent at any game he took a hand in. "The inquiry was all cut and dried business," remarked Queenie. "Arranged. Of course the accounts and things would be cooked. Uncle Simon and Mallett and Coppinger would see to that. They'll have an extra bottle to night over this victory. And if they could only hear to morrow that you're going to clear out, their joy would be full." "Well, I'm not," declared Brent. "Instead of clearing out, I'm going to dig in. I guess they'll find me entrenched harder than ever before long. We'll get on at that to morrow, now that this all hollow inquiry's over." Queenie understood him perfectly that time. He and she were furnishing the house which Brent had purchased in order to get a properly legal footing in Hathelsborough. It was serious and occasionally deeply fascinating work, necessitating much searching of the shops wherein antique furniture was stored, much consultation with upholsterers and decorators, much consideration of style and effect. Brent quickly discovered that Queenie was a young woman of artistic taste, with a natural knowledge and appreciation of colour schemes and values. Queenie found out that Brent had a positive horror of the merely modern. Consequently, this furnishing and decorating business took up all their spare time. Queenie eventually spent all hers at the house, superintending and arranging. Brent was there when he was not writing his Monitor articles or interviewing Hawthwaite. The unproductive inquiry had broken into this domestic adventure. Brent now proposed to go ahead with it until it was finished, then he and Queenie would quietly get married and settle down. Hathelsborough, he remarked, might not want him, but there in Hathelsborough he had set up his tent, and the pegs were firmly driven in. On the day succeeding the Local Government Board inquiry, Brent and Queenie had spent morning, afternoon, and the first part of the evening at the house, at the head of a small gang of workmen, and had reduced at least half of the chaos to order. As dusk grew near, Brent put on his coat and gave Queenie one of his looks which signified that there was no answer needed to what he was about to say. "That's enough," said Brent. "Dog tired. Now we'll go round to the Chancellor and get the best dinner they can give us. Put on your hat." Queenie obeyed readily enough. She was in that stage whereat a young woman finds obedience the most delightful thing in the world. Brent locked up the house, and they went away together towards the hotel. In the old market square the lamps were just being lighted. As usual, there were groups of townsfolk gathered about High Cross and Low Cross, and the pavements were thronged with strolling pedestrians. Something suggested to Brent that all these folk were discussing some news of moment. He heard excited voices; once or twice men glanced inquisitively at Queenie and himself as they walked towards the Chancellor. On the steps outside the hotel a knot of men, amongst them the landlord, were plainly in deep debate. They became silent as Queenie and Brent passed in, and Brent, ushering Queenie into the inner hall, turned back to them. "Something going?" he asked laconically. The men looked at each other; the landlord, with a glance in Queenie's direction, replied, lowering his voice. "Then you haven't heard, Mr. Brent," he said. "I thought you'd have known. Hawthwaite's arrested Krevin Crood for the murder." In spite of his usual self-possession, Brent started. "What!" he exclaimed. "Krevin?" "Krevin," answered the landlord. "And Simon, both of 'em. Got 'em at 7 o'clock. They're in the police station, cells, of course. Nice business, mayor of a town arrested for the murder of his predecessor." "As far as I can make out, Simon's charged with being accessory," remarked one of the other men. Creven's the culprit in chief." "Well, there they both are, anyway," said the landlord. "And if I know anything about the law, it's as serious a thing to be accessory to a murder as to be the principal in one. What do you say, Mr. Brent?" Brent made no reply. He was thinking. So this is what Hawthwaite had meant when he said, the day before, that all was ready. He wished that Hawthwaite had given him a hint, or been perfectly explicit with him. For there was Queenie to consider. And now, without further remark to the group of gossipers, he turned on his heel and went back to her and took her into the coffee room and to the table which was always specially reserved for him. Not until Queenie had eaten her dinner did he tell her of what he had learned. "So now there's going to be hell for a time, girlie," he said in conclusion. "No end of unpleasantness for me, and for you, considering that these men are your folk. And so all the more reason why you and I stick together like leeches. Not all the Simons and the Crevens of the world are going to make any difference between you and me, and we'll just go forward as if they didn't exist, whatever comes out. And now come along, and I'll see you home to Mother Appleyard's, and then I'll drop in on Hawthwaite and learn all about it." Do you think they did it?" asked Queenie, in a fearful whisper. "Actually?" "God knows," muttered Brent. "Damned if I do, or know what to think. But Hawthwaite must have good grounds for this." He saw Queenie safely home to Mrs. Appleyard's and hurried off to the police station, where he found the superintendent alone in his office. "You've heard?" said Hawthwaite. "I've heard," replied Brent. "I wish you'd given me an idea, a hint." Hawthwaite shook his head. There was something peculiarly emphatic in the gesture. "Mr. Brent," he said solemnly, "I wouldn't have given the King himself a hint. I'd reasons, good reasons, for keeping the thing a profound secret until I could strike. As it is, I've been foiled. I've got Kreven Crood and I've got Simon Crood safely under lock and key. But I haven't got the other two." "What other two?" exclaimed Brent. Hawthwaite smiled sourly. "What other two?" he repeated. "Why, Mallett and Coppinger. They're off, though how the devil they got wind of what was going on, I can't think. Leaked out somehow." "You suspect them too?" asked Brent. "Suspect!" sneered Hawthwaite. "Lord, you wait till Simon and Kreven are brought up before the magistrates to morrow morning. We've got the whole evidence so absolutely full and clear that we can go right full steam ahead with the case to morrow. Meeking'll prosecute, and I hope to get 'em committed before the afternoon's over." "Look here," said Brent. "Tell me, what's the line? How does the thing stand?" "Thus," replied Hawthwaite. "We shall charge Kreven with the murder of your cousin, and Simon with being accessory to the fact." "Before or after?" asked Brent. "Before." "And those other two? Mallett and Coppinger?" "Same charge as Simon." Brent took a turn or two about the room. "That," he remarked, pausing at last in front of Hawthwaite's desk, "means that there was a conspiracy?" "To be sure," assented Hawthwaite. "Got proof of it." "Then I wish you'd laid hands on Mallett and Coppinger," said Brent. "You've no idea of their whereabouts, I suppose?" "None so far," replied Hawthwaite. "Nor can I make out how or precisely when they slipped off. But they are off. Oddly enough, Mrs. Mallett's back in the town. I saw and spoke to her an hour ago. Of course she knows nothing about Mallett. She didn't come back to him. I don't know what she came back for. She's staying with friends, down Waterdale." "What time will these men be brought up to morrow morning?" asked Brent. 10 o'clock sharp," answered Hawthwaite. "And I hope that before the end of the afternoon they'll have been fully committed to take their trial. As I said just now, we can go straight on. Careful preparation makes speedy achievement, Mr. Brent, and by the Lord Harry, we've done some preparing." "If only the whole thing is cleared at last," said Brent quietly. "You think, now, it will be?" Hawthwaite smacked his hand on his blotting pad. "Haven't the shadow of a doubt, Mr. Brent, that Kreven Crood murdered your cousin," he asserted. "But you'll hear for yourself to morrow. Come early. And a word of advice." "Yes?" Brent inquired. "Leave your young lady at home," said Hawthwaite. "No need for her feelings to be upset. They're her uncles, these two, after all, you know. Don't bring her." "No, of course," assented Brent. "Never intended to." He went away to his hotel sorely puzzled. Hawthwaite seemed positively confident that he had solved the problem at last. But was Hawthwaite right? Somehow Brent could scarcely think of Krevin Crood as a cold-blooded murderer, nor did it seem probable to him that calculating, scheming men like Simon Crood, Mallett and Coppinger would calmly plot assassination and thereby endanger their own safety. One thing anyway seemed certain. If Wallingford's knowledge of the financial iniquities of the Town Trustees was so deep as to lead them to commit murder as the only way of compelling his silence, then those iniquities must have been formidable indeed, and the great and extraordinary wonder was that they had just been able to cloak them so thoroughly and successfully. He was early in attendance at the court room of the Moot Hall next morning, and for a particular reason of his own selected a seat in close proximity to the door. Long before the magistrates had filed onto the bench, the whole place was packed, and Hawthwaite, passing him, whispered that there were hundreds of people in the market square who could not get in. Everybody of any note in Hathelsborough was present. Brent particularly observed the presence of Mrs. Mallett, who, heavily veiled, sat just beneath him. He looked in vain, however, for Mrs. Saumarez. She was not there. But in a corner, near one of the exits, he saw her companion, Mrs. Elstrick, the woman whom Hawthwaite had seen in secret conversation with Krevin Crood in Farthing Lane. Tansley caught sight of Brent, and leaving the solicitors' table in the well of the court, went over to him. "What are you doing perched out there?" he said. "Come down with me. I'll find room for you." "No," said Brent. "I'm all right here. I may have to leave. And I'm not on in this affair. It's Hawthwaite's show. And is he right, this time?" "God knows!" exclaimed Tansley. "He's something up his sleeve, anyway. Queerest business I ever knew. Simon! If it had been Krevin alone, now! Here, I'll sit by you. I'm not on either. Nobody's instructed me. I say, you'll not notice it, but there's never been such a show of magistrates on that bench for many a year, if ever. Crowded. Every magistrate in the place present. And the chief magistrate to be in the dock presently. That's dramatic effect, if you like." Brent was watching the dock. Prisoners came into it by a staircase at the back. Krevin came first, cool, collected, calmly defiant. Outwardly he was less concerned than any spectator. But Simon shambled heavily forward, his big flabby face coloured with angry resentment and shame. He beckoned to his solicitor and began to talk eagerly to him over the separating partition. He, it was evident, was all nerves and eagerness. But Krevin, after a careful look round the court, during which he exchanged nods with several of his acquaintance, stood staring reflectively at Meeking, as if speculating on what the famous barrister was going to say in opening the case. Meeking said little. The prisoners, he observed, addressing the bench in quiet conversational tones, were charged, Krevin Crood with the actual murder of the late Mayor John Wallingford, Simon with being accessory to the fact, and, if they had not absconded during the previous 24 hours, two other well-known residents of the borough, Stephen Mallett and James Coppinger, would have stood in the dock with Simon Crood, similarly charged. He should show their worships by the evidence which he would produce that patient and exhaustive investigation by the local police had brought to light as wicked a conspiracy as could well be imagined. There could be no doubt in the mind of any reasonable person, after hearing that evidence, that Simon Crood, Mallett and Coppinger entered into a plot to rid themselves of a man who, had his investigations continued, would infallibly have exposed their nefarious practices to the community, nor that they employed Krevin Crood to carry out their designs. He would show that the murder of Wallingford was deliberately plotted at Mallett's house, between the four men, on a certain particular date, and that Krevin Crood committed the actual murder on the following evening. Thanks to the particularly able and careful fashion in which Superintendent Hawthwaite had marshalled the utterly damning body of evidence against these men, their worships would have no difficulty in deciding that there was a prima facie case against them, and that they must be committed to take their trial at the next assizes. Hawthwaite, called first, gave evidence as to the arrest of the two prisoners. He arrested Krevin Crood in the passage leading from Bull's Snug about 6:30 the previous evening, and Simon at his own home half an hour later. Krevin took the matter calmly, and merely remarked that he, Hawthwaite, was making the biggest mistake he had ever made in his life. Simon manifested great anger and indignation, and threatened an action for false imprisonment. When actually charged, neither of the accused made any answer at all. The superintendent stood down, and Meeking looked towards an inner door of the court. An attendant came forward at his nod, bearing a heavy package done up in crown canvas and sealed. At the same moment a smart-looking young man answered to the name of Samuel Owthwaite, and stepped alertly into the witness box. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. Corruption. The tightly wedged mass of spectators watched, open-mouthed and quivering with anticipation, while the attendant, at Meeking's whispered bidding, broke the seals and cut the strings of the package which he had just carried in. Clearly this was some piece of material evidence, but what? A faint murmur of interest rose as the last wrappings fell aside, and revealed a somewhat the worse for wear typewriter. People glanced from it to the witness. Some of those present recognized him as a young mechanic, a native of Hathelsborough, who had gone, a few years previously, to work in the neighbouring manufacturing city of Clothford. Such began to ask themselves what he could have to do with this case, and waited eagerly for his evidence. But Meeking, the battered typewriter before him, kept the witness waiting. Turning to the bench, he put the depositions taken at the coroner's inquest with respect to the typewritten threatening letter sent to Wallingford and by him entrusted to Epplewhite, the letter itself, and the facsimile of the letter published as a supplement by the Monitor, with a brief explanation of his reasons for bringing them into evidence. Then he addressed himself to his witness, and got the first facts from him. Samuel Owthwaite, mechanic, employed by Green and Polford Limited, of Clothford, agents for all the leading firms of typewriter manufacturers. "I believe you're a native of Hathelsborough, aren't you, Owthwaite?" began Meeking. "I am, sir." "Keep up your interest in the old place, eh?" "I do, sir." "Have you any relations in the town?" "Yes, sir, several." "Do they send you the Hathelsborough paper, the Monitor, every week?" "Yes, sir, regularly." "Did they send you a copy of the Monitor in which there was a facsimile of the threatening letter addressed to the late Mayor by some anonymous correspondent?" "Yes, sir." "Did you look at the facsimile?" "I did, sir." "Notice anything peculiar or strange or remarkable about it?" "Yes, sir. I noticed that some of the letters were broken and some defective." "You noticed that as an expert mechanic, working at these things?" "It was obvious to anybody, sir. The letters, some of them, were badly broken." "Look at the dock, Owthwaite. Do you know the prisoner, Simon Crood?" "Well enough, sir." "How long have you known him?" "Ever since I was a youngster, sir. Always." "Have you ever seen Simon Crood at Green and Polford's, your employers?" "I have, sir." "When was that?" "He came in 2 days after I had seen the facsimile, sir." "Bring anything with him?" "Yes, sir, that typewriter before you." "Sure it was this particular machine?" "Positive, sir. It's an old Semingford machine, number 32,587. "Did you hear him say anything about it?" "I did, sir. He told our Mr. Jeaveson, manager he is, that this was a machine he'd bought in London many years ago; that the lettering seemed to be getting worn out, and that he wanted to know if we could supply new letters and do the machine up generally. Yes, what then? Mr. Jeeves had said we could, and the machine was handed over to me for repair. Did you make any discovery about it? Yes, sir. That afternoon I just ran the lettering off to see what defects there were. I found then that the broken and defective letters were identical with those in the facsimile letter that I'd seen in the Monitor 2 days before. Just come down here, Outhwaite. Take this sheet of paper and run the letters off again, so that their worships can compare the broken and defective letters with those in the threatening letter. Now, continued Meeking, when the mechanic had complied with this suggestion and gone back to the witness box, what did you do on making this discovery? I told Mr. Jeeveson about it, sir, and showed him what I meant. He discussed the matter with Mr. Polford afterwards, and it was decided that I should go over to Hathelsborough and see Mr. Hawthwaite, taking the machine with me. Did you do that? Yes, sir, next day in the evening. Did you tell Superintendent Hawthwaite of your discovery and hand the machine over to him? Yes, sir, both. Did he have the machine wrapped and sealed up in your presence? He did, sir. This machine now, on the table? That machine, sir. And this is the machine that the prisoner, Simon Crood, brought himself to Green and Polford's? That's the machine, sir. Meeking nodded to his witness, signifying that he had no more to ask, but before Outhwaite could leave the box, Stedman, the local solicitor, with whom Simon Crood had held a whispered conversation on coming into court, rose and began to cross-examine him. Did you happen to be in Green and Polford's shop, the front shop, I mean, when Alderman Crood brought in that machine? He asked. I was there at the time, sir, replied Outhwaite. Did he come quite openly? Yes, sir, in a cab, as a matter of fact. The cabman carried in the machine. Did Alderman Crood say who he was? Well, sir, to be exact, he saw me as soon as he came in and recognized me. He said, "Oh, a Hathelsborough lad, I see. You'll know me, young man." Then he told Mr. Jeeveson and myself what he wanted. The whole business was quite open and above board, then? Quite so, sir. He drew your attention himself to the defects of the machine? He did, sir. And this was after, not before, that facsimile appeared in the Monitor? After, sir. Now, I want a particularly careful answer, Outhwaite, to my next question. Did Alderman Crood ask you to get these repairs made immediately? No, sir, he did not. He said he was in no hurry. You were to take your own time about them, the machine remaining with you? Just that, sir. Stedman sat down, as if satisfied, and Outhwaite left the witness box. At the calling of the next witness's name, Tansley nudged Brent. Now we may hear something lively, he whispered. This chap's been the borough accountant for some years, and I've often wondered if he doesn't know a good deal that he's kept to himself. But if he does, will he let it out? Old Crood doesn't look over pleased to see him, anyway. Brent glanced from the new witness, a quiet, reserved-looking man of middle age, to Simon Crood. There was a dark scowl on the heavy features, and Brent fancied a look of apprehension. Once more Simon beckoned to his solicitor and exchanged a few whispered words with him across the front of the dock before turning to the witness. And to him Brent also turned with an instinctive feeling that he possibly held a key to those mysteries which had not yet been produced. Matthew James Nettleton, member of the Society of Incorporated Accountants and Auditors, Borough Accountant of Hathelsborough during the last 7 years. During that period in close touch with all the persons concerned in the present matter. Mr. Nettleton, said Meeking, you are the Borough Accountant of Hathelsborough? The witness folded his hands on the ledge of the box and shook his head. No, he answered. Was. Was? What do you mean? I have resigned my appointment. When? Yesterday at 6 o'clock last evening, to be precise. May I ask why? You may, sir. Because I knew the inquiry just held by the inspector of the local government board to be an absolute farce. because I know that the financial affairs of the borough are rotten ripe, because I utterly refuse to be a cat's paw in the hands of the Town Trustees any longer. Those are my reasons." Tansley dug his elbow into Brent's ribs as an irrepressible murmur of surprise broke out all round the court. But Brent was watching the men in the dock. Krevin Crood smiled cynically. The smile developed into a short, sharp laugh. But Simon's flabby face turned a dull red, and presently he lifted his big silk handkerchief and wiped his forehead. Meeking waited a moment, letting the witness's outburst have its full effect. Then, amidst a dead silence, he leaned towards the box. "Why didn't you say all that at the recent inquiry?" he asked. "Because it wouldn't have been a scrap of good," retorted the witness. "Those affairs are all cut and dried. My only course was to do what I did last night resign, and to give evidence now." Meeking twisted his gown together and looked at the magistrates. He ran his eye carefully along the row of faces, and finally let it settle again on his witness. "Tell their worships, in your own fashion, your considered opinion as to the state of the borough finances," he said. "Your opinion, based on your experience." "They are, as I said just now, absolutely rotten," declared Nettleton. "It is now 7 years since I came to this place as borough accountant. I found that under an ancient charter the whole of the financial business of the borough was in the hands of a small body known as the Town Trustees, 3 only in number. It is marvellous that such a body should be allowed to exist in these days. The Town Trustees are responsible to nobody. They elect themselves; that is to say, if one dies, the surviving 2 elect his successor. They are not bound to render accounts to anyone. The Corporation, of which they are a permanent committee, only knows what they choose to tell. This has gone on for at least 3 centuries. It may have served some good purpose at some period, under men of strict probity, but in my opinion, based on such experience as I have been able to command, it has of late years led to nothing but secret peculation, jobbery and knavery. As regards my own position, it has simply been that I have never at any time been permitted to see any accounts other than those placed before me by the Town Trustees. My belief is that no one but themselves actually knows what the financial condition of the town really is. I am of the impression that this Corporation, as a corporation, is bankrupt." There now arose a murmur in court which the chairman and officials found it difficult to suppress. But curiosity prevailed over excitement, and the silence was deep enough when Meeking got in his next question. "You affirm all this in face of the recent inquiry?" "I do, and strongly. The accounts shown at the recent inquiry were all carefully manipulated, arranged, cooked by the Town Trustees. I had nothing to do with them. They were prepared by the Town Trustees, chiefly, I imagine, by Mallett and Coppinger, with Crood's approval and consent. They were never shown to me. In short, my position has been this, simply: I have had certain accounts placed before me by the Town Trustees with the curt intimation that my sole duty was to see that the merely arithmetical features were correct and to sign them as accountant." "Could you not have made a statement to this effect at the inquiry?" "I could not." "Why, now?" "Because I could not have produced the books and papers. All the books and papers to which I have ever had access are merely such things as rate books and so on, the sort of things that can't be concealed. But the really important books and papers, showing the real state of things, are in the possession of Mallett and Coppinger, who, with Crood, have never allowed anybody to see them. If I could have had those things brought before the inspector, I could have proved something. But I couldn't bring them before a court of inquiry like that. You can bring them before this." "How?" demanded Meeking. "Because, I take it, they bear a very sinister relation to the murder of the late Mayor," replied the witness. "He was as well aware as I am that things were all wrong." "You know that?" "I know that he did his best, from such material as he could get at, to find out what the true state of things was. He worked hard at examining such accounts as were available. To my knowledge, he did his best to get at the secret accounts kept by the Town Trustees. He failed utterly. They defied him. Yet just before his murder he was getting at facts in a fashion which was not only unpleasant but highly dangerous to them, and they were aware of it." "Can you give us an example of any of these facts these discoveries?" "Yes, I can give you one in particular. Wallingford was slowly but surely getting at the knowledge of the system of secret payment which has gone on in this place for a long time under the rule of the Town Trustees. He had found out the truth, for instance, as regards Krevin Crood. Krevin Crood was supposed to be paid a pension of £150 a year. In reality he was paid £300 a year. Wallingford ascertained this beyond all doubt, and that it had gone on ever since Krevin Crood's retirement from his official position. There are other men in the borough, hangers-on and supporters of the Town Trustees, who benefit by public money in the shape of pensions, grants, doles. In every case the actual amount paid is much more than the amount set down in such accounts as are shown. Wallingford meant to sweep all this jobbery away." "How?" "By getting the financial affairs of the town into the full and absolute control of the Corporation. He wanted to abolish the Town Trustees as a body. If he had succeeded in his aims, he would have done away with all the abuses which they not only kept up, but encouraged." "Then, if Wallingford's reforms had been carried out, Krevin Crood would have lost £150 a year?" "He would have lost £300 a year. Wallingford's scheme included the utter abolition of all these Town Trustee-created pensions and doles. Lock, stock and barrel, they were all to go." "And the Town Trustees Crood, Mallett, Croppinger were fully acquainted with his intentions and those of his party?" The witness shrugged his shoulders. "That's well known," he answered. "They were frightened of him and his schemes to the last degree. They knew what it meant." "What did it mean?" Nettleton glanced at Simon Crood and smiled. "Just what it's come to at last," he said. "Exposure and disgrace." "Well," said Meeking, when a murmur of excited feeling had once more run round the court, "a more particular question, Mr. Nettleton. Did the late Mayor ever come to your office in the course of his investigations?" "He did, frequently. Not that I had much to show him. But he carefully examined all the books and papers of which I was in possession." "Did he make notes?" "Notes and memoranda, yes. At considerable length, sometimes." "What in?" "In a thickish memorandum book, with a stout cover of red leather, which he always carried in his pocket." "Could you identify that book if you saw it?" "Certainly. Besides, you would find it full of his notes and figures." "That will do for the present, Mr. Nettleton, unless my friend here wants to examine you. No? Then recall Superintendent Hawthwaite for a moment. Superintendent, you have just heard of a certain pocket book which belonged to the late Mayor. Was it found on his dead body, or on his desk, or anywhere, after the murder? No? Not after the most careful and thorough search? Completely disappeared? Very good. Now let us have Louisa Speck." A smartly dressed, self-possessed young woman came forward, and Tansley, nudging Brent, whispered to him that this was Mallett's parlour maid, and that things were getting deuced interesting. Chapter 22 of The Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Parlour Maid. That the appearance of Louisa Speck in the witness box came as something more than an intense surprise to at any rate two particular persons in the court was evidence at once to Brent's watchful eye. Mrs. Mallett, a close observer of what was going on, started as her parlour maid's name was called, and lifting her eyeglass surveyed the girl with a wondering stare of prolonged inspection. And in the dock Krevin Crood also let a start of astonishment escape him. He, too, stared at Louisa Speck, and a frown showed itself between his eyebrows as if he were endeavouring to explain her presence to himself. Suddenly it cleared, and he indulged his fancies with a sharp laugh, and turning to Simon made some whispered observation. Simon nodded sullenly, as if he comprehended. From that point forward he kept his small eyes firmly fixed on the witness. Tansley, too, noticed these things, and bent towards his companion with a meaning glance. "This young woman knows something," he muttered, "and those two chaps in the dock know what it is." The young woman upon whom all eyes were fixed was perhaps the most self-possessed person present. She answered the preliminary questions as coolly as if she had been giving evidence in murder cases as a regular thing. Louisa Speck, 26 years of age. Been in the employ of Mrs. Mallett of the Bank House for 3 years. Still in that employment as far as she knew. What did she mean by that? Well, that Mrs. Mallett had left the house some days before, and that since yesterday afternoon Mr. Mallett had not been there, and accordingly neither she nor the other servants knew exactly where things stood. "Just so," observed Meeking. "Somewhat uncertain, eh? Very well." He paused a moment, glanced at his papers, and suddenly leaned forward towards the witness box with a sharp, direct look at its occupant. "Now then," he said, "when did you first hear of the murder of the late Mayor, Mr. Wallingford?" Louisa Speck's answer came promptly. "The night it happened." "What time? And who told you of it?" "About 9 o'clock. Robertshaw, the policeman, told me. I was at the front door, looking out on the market square, and he was going past." "I see. So you remember that evening very well?" "Quite well." "Do you remember the previous evening equally well?" "Yes." "Were you at the Bank House that evening, the evening before the murder?" "I was." "What was going on there that evening? Anything that makes you particularly remember it?" "Yes." "What, now?" "Well, Mrs. Mallett went away that day to visit her sister, Mrs. Coppinger, for a day or two. About noon Mr. Mallett told me and cook that he wanted to have some gentlemen for dinner that evening, and we were to prepare accordingly." "I see. Sort of special dinner, eh?" "Yes." "Did the gentlemen come?" "Yes." "Who were they?" "Mr. Coppinger and Alderman Crood." "What time was that?" "Between 6 and half past." "What happened after their arrival?" "They went into the morning room with Mr. Mallett. I took some brown sherry in there, and glasses. Soon after that Mr. Mallett went out. I was just inside the dining room as he crossed over the hall. He told me there'd very likely be another gentleman to dinner, and I must lay another cover. He went out, and was away about 10 minutes. Then he came back with Mr. Krevin Crood." "Came back with Mr. Krevin Crood. Did you see them come in together?" "I let them in." "Did you hear anything said as they entered?" "Yes, I heard Mr. Krevin Crood say that he wasn't dressed for dinner parties. Mr. Mallett then told me to take Mr. Krevin upstairs and get him anything he wanted." "Did you take Mr. Krevin upstairs?" "Yes, I took him up to Mr. Mallett's dressing room. I showed him the hot water arrangement, got him clean towels, and asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted a clean shirt, a collar, and a handkerchief." "A handkerchief?" "Yes, a handkerchief." "Did you get him these things?" "I showed him where to get them. I opened the drawers in which Mr. Mallett's shirts, collars, and handkerchiefs are kept, so that he could help himself. Then I asked him if there was anything else more I could get him. He said there was nothing but a clothes brush. I got him that and left him." "When did you see him next?" "About 20 minutes after, when he came downstairs and went into the morning room to the other gentlemen." "Was he smartened up then?" "He was smart enough smarter than the others, I should say." "Had he taken one of Mr. Mallett's shirts?" "Yes, one of his very best white ones." "Very good. Now then, talking about shirts, who looks after the laundry affairs at the Bank House?" "I do." "You send the linen to the laundry?" "Yes." "And receive it and put it away when it comes back?" "Yes." "Always?" "Always." "When does it go, and when does it return?" It goes on Monday morning and comes home on Saturday afternoon." "Do you put it away on Saturday afternoon?" "Not finally. It goes into a hot cupboard to air. Then on Monday some time I put it away in the proper place, sort it out." "I see. Do you remember sorting it out and putting away the different articles in their proper places on the Monday before this little dinner party?" "Yes, I do." "Did you notice the presence of any article which didn't belong to the Mallett family?" "Yes. At least, I was doubtful." "Doubtful, eh? Well, what was it?" "A gentleman's handkerchief." "You weren't sure that it was Mr. Mallett's?" "I wasn't sure that it wasn't, and I didn't think it was." "Why were you uncertain?" "Well, this wasn't like Mr. Mallett's handkerchiefs. He had dozens of them, nearly all fancy ones, with coloured borders. This was a very fine cambric handkerchief. I'd never seen one like it before. But still I wasn't certain that it wasn't Mr. Mallett's after all." "Why?" "Because sometimes, when Mr. Mallett was away for the day, he'd buy a spare handkerchief. He's a lot of odd handkerchiefs that he's brought home in his pockets. I thought that this might have been got that way." "You didn't mention its presence to anybody?" "No, I didn't think of it." "Well, what did you do with the handkerchief about which you were doubtful?" "I laid it on top of one of several piles of handkerchiefs that were in Mr. Mallett's handkerchief drawer in the dressing room." "Why did you put it on top?" "In case any inquiry was made about it from Marriner's Laundry." "Was any inquiry made?" "No." "Now, was that drawer you have just spoken of the drawer that you pulled open for Mr. Krevin Crood?" "Yes." "Was the handkerchief there then?" "Yes, it was there." "You saw it?" "I saw it." "Have you ever seen it since?" "Never." "Do you know if Mr. Krevin Crood took it out of the drawer?" "No." "Did you see it in his possession that evening?" "No, I didn't, but it wasn't in the drawer next morning." "You are sure of that?" "Positive. I went into Mr. Mallett's dressing room very early next morning, and I noticed that Mr. Krevin had left the drawers half open. The handkerchief drawer stuck a little, and I pulled it right out before pushing it in. I noticed then that the handkerchief had gone." "Did you conclude that Mr. Krevin had taken it?" "No, I don't think so. I didn't conclude anything. If I thought anything, it would be that Mr. Mallett had taken it. Mr. Mallett would think nothing of taking half a dozen handkerchiefs a day." "But the handkerchief was there when you opened the drawer for Mr. Krevin that evening, and it wasn't there when you looked into the drawer next morning early. That so?" "Yes, that's so." "Very well. Now then, about this little dinner. Mr. Mallett had three guests, Mr. Simon Crood, Mr. Krevin Crood, Mr. Coppinger? Nobody else?" "No, no one else." "Was it a nice dinner?" "It was a very good dinner." "Wine?" "There were several sorts of wine." "What time was dinner?" "About 7:15." "And what time did the gentlemen rise from the table?" "They didn't rise from the table. When dinner was over, Mr. Mallett decanted some very special port that he has in the wine cellar, and they settled down to it round the dinner table talking." "I see. Did you hear any of the conversation?" "No, I didn't. I carried 2 decanters of the port into the dining room for Mr. Mallett, and got out port glasses from the sideboard, and after that I never went into the room again." "Until what hour did Mr. Mallett's guests remain with him?" "Well, Alderman Crood and Mr. Krevin Crood left at about 11:15. They went away together. Mr. Coppinger stopped till about 11:30. Meeking paused at this point, put his hand underneath the papers which lay in front of him, and produced a cardboard box. From this, after slowly undoing various wrappings, he took the fragment of stained and charred handkerchief which had been found in the Mayor's Parlour, and passed it across to the witness. "Take that in your hand and look at it carefully," he said. "Now, do you recognise that as part of the handkerchief to which I have been referring?" "It's the same sort of stuff," replied Louisa. "I should say it was part of that handkerchief. It's just like it." "Same material? An unusual material?" I think it is the same handkerchief. It's an unusually broad hem. I noticed that at the time." "To the best of your belief, is that the handkerchief you've been talking about?" "Yes," declared Louisa Speck, this time without hesitation. "It is." Meeking sat down and glanced at Simon Crood's solicitor. Stedman accepted the challenge, and rising, threw some scornful meanings into his first question to the witness. "Who got you to tell all this tale?" he asked satirically. "Who got at you?" Louisa Speck bridled. "Nobody got at me," she retorted. "What do you mean by such a question?" "You don't mean to tell their Worships that you haven't been induced to come forward and tell all this?" suggested Stedman incredulously. "Come, now, who helped you to refresh your memory and to put all this together?" "Nobody helped me," replied Louisa Speck with rising indignation. "Do you think I'm not capable of doing things on my own? I can use my eyes and ears as well as you can, and perhaps better." "Answer my question," said Stedman, as a laugh rose against him. "Who got you to go to the police?" "Nobody got me to go to the police. I went to the police on my own account. I read the newspaper about what took place at the inquest the last inquest, I mean and as soon as I heard about the handkerchief I knew very well that that was the one I'd noticed in our laundry, and so I went to see Mr. Hawthwaite. Mr. Hawthwaite's known what I had to tell you for a good while now." Stedman was taken aback. But he put a definite question. "On your oath, did you see that handkerchief in Mr. Krevin Crood's possession that night he was at Mr. Mallett's?" he asked. "I've already told him I never did," retorted Louisa Speck, pointing at Meeking. "I didn't see him with it, but I'm very certain he got it." Stedman waved the witness away, and Meeking proceeded to put in the depositions taken before the Coroner in regard to the finding of the fragment of handkerchief and its ownership, and called evidence to show that the piece just produced was that which had been picked up from the hearth in the Mayor's Parlour on the evening of the murder, soon after the finding of the dead man, and to prove that it had remained in the custody of the police ever since. The fragment went the round of the bench of magistrates, and Tansley whispered to Brent that if Meeking could prove that Krevin Crood had taken that handkerchief out of Mallett's drawer and had thrown it away on the following evening in the Mayor's Parlour, Krevin's neck was in danger. "But there's a link missing yet," he murmured. "How did Krevin get at Wallingford? They've got to prove that. However, Meeking's evidently well primed and knows what he's after. What's coming next?" What came next was the glancing of the barrister's eye towards a venerable, grey-bearded man who sat in the front row of spectators, leaning on a gold-headed cane. He rose as Meeking looked at him, and came slowly forward, a curious figure in those sombre surroundings. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The Connecting Wall. From a certain amount of whispering and nodding that went on around him, Brent gathered that this ancient gentleman was not unknown to many of those present. But Tansley was turning to him, ready as always with information. "That's old Dr. Pellery," he whispered. "Old Dr. Septimus Pellery. Tremendous big pot on antiquarianism, archaeology, and that sort of stuff. Used to live here in Hathelsborough years ago, when I was a youngster. I should have thought he was dead long since. Wonder where they unearthed him, and what he's here for. No end of a swell, in his own line, anyway." Meeking seemed determined to impress on the court the character and extent of Dr. Pellery's qualifications as an expert in archaeological matters. Addressing him in an almost reverential manner, he proceeded to enumerate the witness's distinctions. "Dr. Pellery, you are, I believe, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries?" "I have that honour." "And a member of more than one archaeological society?" "I am." "And a corresponding member of various foreign societies of a similar sort?" "For many years." You are also, I think, a Doctor of Civil Law of the University of Oxford?" "Yes." "And the author of many books and articles on your pet subject, archaeology?" "That is so." "Am I right, Dr. Pellery, in believing that you are thoroughly well acquainted with the archaeology, antiquities, and ancient architecture of this town?" "Quite right. I lived here for several years 10 or 11 years." "That was when?" "It is about 20 years since I left this place." "You made a close study of it while you were resident here?" "A very close study. Hathelsborough, from my point of view, is one of the most deeply interesting towns in England. While I lived here I accumulated a vast mass of material respecting its history and antiquities, with the idea of writing a monograph on the borough. But I have never made use of it." "Let us hope that you will still do so, Dr. Pellery," said Meeking, with a suave smile and polite bow. But Dr. Pellery shook his head and stroked his long beard. A cynical smile played round his wrinkled eyes. "No, I don't think I ever shall," he said. "Indeed, I'm sure I shan't." "May I ask why?" "You may. Because there aren't 20 people in Hathelsborough who would buy such a book. Hathelsborough people don't care twopence about the history of their old town. All they care about is money. This case is a proof." "I think we'll get back to the case," said Meeking, amidst a ripple of laughter. "Well, we may consider you as the greatest living expert on Hathelsborough anyway, Dr. Pellery, and eminently fitted to give us some very important evidence. Do you know the ancient church of St. Lawrence at the back of this Moot Hall?" "Aye, as well as I know my own face in the glass," answered Dr. Pellery with a short laugh. "Every stone of it." "It is, I believe, a very old church?" "It is the oldest church not only in Hathelsborough, which is saying a good deal, but in all this part of the country," replied the witness with emphasis. "St. Hathelswide, the parish church, is old, but St. Lawrence antedates it by at least 500 years. The greater part of St. Lawrence, as it now stands, was complete in the 8th century. St. Hathelswide was built in the 13th." Meeking produced a large chart, evidently made for the occasion, and had it set up on the table, in full view of the bench and the witness box. "From this plan, Dr. Pellery, it appears that the west tower, a square tower, of St. Lawrence immediately faces the back of the Moot Hall, and between the outer hall of the tower and the outer wall of the Moot Hall there is a sort of connecting wall." "Not a sort of," interrupted Dr. Pellery. "It is a connecting wall, 36 feet long, 10 feet high, and 8 feet in width, forming an arch over the street beneath, the narrow street called St. Lawrence Lane." "It is an uncommon feature, that wall?" suggested Meeking. "Comparatively, yes. I know of other places where ancient buildings are so joined, but there are few examples." "Well, I want to ask you a very important question about that connecting wall. Is there a secret way through that wall from St. Lawrence Tower to the Moot Hall?" Dr. Pellery drew himself up, stroked his beard, and glanced round the court. Then he gave Meeking an emphatic nod. "There is, and I discovered it, years ago, and I have always thought that I was the only living person who knew of it." Meeking let this answer soak into the mentality of his hearers. Then he said quietly, "Will you tell us all about it, Dr. Pellery?" "Enough for your purpose," replied the witness. "You have there, I believe, a sectional drawing of the tower. Give it to me. Now," he continued, holding up a sheet of stout paper and illustrating his remarks with the tip of his forefinger, "I will show you what I mean. St. Lawrence Tower is 80 feet in height. It is divided into 3 sections. The lower section, the most considerable of the 3, forms a western porch to the church itself, which is entered from it by a Norman arch. Above this is the middle section, above that the upper section, wherein are 3 ancient bells. The middle and upper sections are reached from the lower by a newel stair, set in the southwest angle of the tower. Now, the middle section has for many centuries been a beamed and panelled chamber, from which the bells are rung, and wherein are stored a good many old things belonging to the church, chiefly in ancient chests. During the years that I lived in Hathelsborough, I spent a great deal of time in this chamber. The then Vicar of St. Lawrence, Mr. Goodbody, allowed me to examine anything I found stored there. It was amongst the muniments and registers of St. Lawrence, indeed, that I discovered a great deal of valuable information about the history of the town. Well, I have just said that this chamber, this middle section of the tower, is panelled. It is panelled from the oak flooring to within 2 feet of the oak beams in its ceiling, and the panelling, though it is probably 400 years old, is in an excellent state of preservation. Now, about the middle of the last year that I spent in this town, I began to be very puzzled about the connecting wall between St. Lawrence Tower and the Moot Hall. I saw no reason for making an arch at that point, and the wall had certainly not been built as a support, for the masonry of the tower and of the hall is unusually solid. I got the idea that that wall had been originally built as a means of communication between tower and hall, that it was hollow, and that there at each extremity there was a secret means of entrance and exit. I knew from experience that this sort of thing was common in Hathelsborough. The older part of the town is a veritable rabbit warren. There is scarcely a house in the market-place, for instance, in which there is not a double staircase, the inner one being very cleverly concealed, and I know of several secret ways and passages, entered, say, on one side of a street and terminating far off on another. There is a secret underground way between the market square, which is entered at the Barbican in the castle, and terminates in St. Faith's Chapel in St. Hathelswide's Church. There is another, also underground, from St. Matthias's Hospital to the God's House in Cripple Lane. There are others. As I say, the old town is honeycombed. So there would be, of course, nothing unusual or remarkable in the presence of a secret passage between St. Lawrence Tower and the Moot Hall. The only thing was that there was no record of any such passage through the connecting wall. No one had ever heard of it, and there were no signs of entrance to it either in the tower or in the Moot Hall. However, I discovered it by careful and patient investigation of the panelling in the chamber I have mentioned. The panelling is divided on each side of the chamber into 7 compartments. The 4th compartment on the outer wall slides back and gives access to a passage cut through the arch across St. Lawrence Lane and so to the Moot Hall. "There's one man here who knows all this," whispered Tansley in Brent's ear. "Look at Krevin Crood." Krevin was smiling. There was something unusually cynical in his smile, but it conveyed more than cynical amusement to Brent. There was in it the suggestion of assurance. Krevin, decided Brent, had something up his sleeve. But the other people present were still intent on the old antiquary. Having come to the end of his explanation, he was passing back the chart to Meeking, and seemed satisfied with what he had said. Meeking, however, wanted more. "To the Moot Hall," he repeated. "Well, Dr. Pellery, and where does this passage emerge in the Moot Hall?" "Just so," said Dr. Pellery. "That, of course, is important. Well, the wall or arch between St. Lawrence Tower and the Moot Hall, on reaching the outer wall of the latter, is continued within, from that outer wall along the right-hand side of the corridor off which the extremely ancient chamber known as the Mayor's Parlour is situated. If close examination is made of that wall, you will find that it is 8 feet thick. But it is not a solid wall. The secret passage I have mentioned runs through it, to a point halfway along the length of the Mayor's Parlour, and access to the Mayor's Parlour is had by a secret door in the old panelling of that chamber, just as in the case of the chamber in the church tower." "You investigated all this yourself, Dr. Pellery?" "Discovered and investigated it." "And kept the secret to yourself?" "I did. I saw no reason for communicating it to anyone." "However, as you discovered it, it was not impossible that others should make the same discovery?" "It is very evident that somebody has discovered it," replied the witness with emphasis. "Now you say that it is about 20 years since you made this discovery. Have you been in St. Lawrence Tower since?" "Yes, Superintendent Hawthwaite has been in communication with me, privately, about this matter for some time. I came to Hathelsborough yesterday, and in the afternoon he and I visited the tower, and I showed him the secret way and the doors in the panelling. We passed from the tower into the Mayor's Parlour, as you or anyone may just now, if you know the secret of the sliding panels." "Is it what you would call a difficult secret?" "Not a bit of it, once you have hit on the exact spot at which to exert a pressure. The panels are then moved back quite easily." "Your evidence, then, Dr. Pellery, comes to this. There is a secret passage through the apparently solid arch in St. Lawrence Lane, which leads directly from the middle chamber in St. Lawrence Tower to the Mayor's Parlour in the Moot Hall. Is that correct?" Dr. Pellery made an old-fashioned bow. "That is absolutely correct." "I am sure the court is greatly obliged to you, sir," said Meeking, responding to the old man's courtesy. He looked round, and seeing that Stedman made no sign, glanced at the policeman who stood by the witness box. "Call Stephen Spizey," he commanded. Spizey moved ponderously into the box in all the glory of his time-honoured livery. He looked very big and very consequential, and unusually glum. Meeking, who was not a Hathelsborough man, glanced quizzingly at Spizey's grandeur and at the cocked hat which Spizey placed on the ledge before him. "You're some sort of a Corporation official, aren't you, Spizey?" he suggested. "Apparitor to His Worshipful the Mayor of Hathelsborough," responded Spizey in his richest tones. "Mace-bearer to his Worship, town-crier, bellman, steward of the pound, steward of High Cross and Low Cross, summoner of Thursday market, convener of Saturday market, receiver of dues and customs—" "You appear to be a good deal of a pluralist," interrupted Meeking. "However, are you caretaker of St. Lawrence Church?" "I am." "Do you live in a cottage at the corner of St. Lawrence churchyard?" "I do." "Do you remember the evening on which Mr. Wallingford was murdered?" "Yes." "At 7 o'clock of that evening were you in your cottage?" "I was." "Did Mr. Krevin Crood come to your cottage door about 7 o'clock and ask you for the keys of St. Lawrence?" "He did." "Did he say why he wanted to go into the church?" "Yes, to write out an inscription for a London gent as wanted it." "Did you give him the keys?" "I did." "Did you see him go into the church?" "Yes, and hear him lock himself inside it." "Did he eventually bring the keys back?" "Not to me. My missus." Meeking waved Spizey's magnificence aside and called for Mrs. Spizey. Mrs. Spizey, too, readily remembered the evening under discussion, and said so, with a sniff which seemed to indicate decided disapproval of her memories respecting it. "What were you doing that evening, Mrs. Spizey?" asked Meeking. "Which for the most part of it, sir, I was a-washing of that very floor as you're a-standing on, sir, me being cleaner to the Moot Hall. That 'ud be from 6 to 8." "Then you went home, I suppose?" "I did, sir, and very thankful, too." "Was your husband at home?" "He were not, sir. Which Spizey had gone out to have his glass, sir, as is his custom." "Did Mr. Krevin Crood come to you with the keys of the church?" "He did, sir, which the clock had just struck 8, and remarked, sir, that the light was failing, and that his eyes wasn't as strong as they had been. Pleasant like, sir." "I see. Had Mr. Krevin Crood any papers in his hand?" "He had papers in his hand, sir, or under his arm." "And that was just after 8 o'clock?" "The clocks had just struck it, sir." Meeking nodded his dismissal of Mrs. Spizey. It was plain that he was getting near the end of his case, and his manner became sharp and almost abrupt. "Call Detective Sergeant Welton," he said. "Welton, were you present when Superintendent Hawthwaite arrested the prisoner Krevin Crood, and afterwards when the other prisoner, Simon Crood, was taken into custody?" "I was, sir." "Did you afterwards, on Superintendent Hawthwaite's instructions, search Krevin Crood's lodgings and Simon Crood's house?" "I did, sir." "Tell their Worships what you found." "I first made a search at the rooms occupied by Krevin Crood in Little Bailey Gate. I there found in an old writing case kept in his bedroom a quantity of papers and documents in the handwriting of the late Mayor, Mr. Wallingford. I handed these over to Superintendent Hawthwaite. I now produce them. There are 56 separate papers in all. I have gone through them carefully. All relate to Corporation accounts and to the financial affairs of the borough. Several are blood-stained." There was a shiver of horror among the women present as the witness handed over a sheaf of various sized papers, indicating where the stains lay. But the even-toned, matter-of-fact, coldly official voice went on. "Later I made a search of the prisoner Simon Crood's house at the tannery. In a desk in a room which he used as a private office, I found more papers and documents similar to those which I had found at Krevin Crood's lodgings. I produced these. There are 17 separate papers. All are in the handwriting of the late Mr. Wallingford. I also discovered in a drawer of Simon Crood's bedroom a memorandum book, bound in red leather, the greater part of which is filled with notes and figures made by the late Mayor. I produced this too. I also identify it as a book which the late Mayor was in the habit of carrying about with him. I have frequently seen him make use of it." While every neck was craned forward to catch a glimpse of the memorandum book, Tansley suddenly saw Krevin Crood making signals to him from the dock. He drew Brent's attention to the fact, then went down into the well of the court and over to Krevin. Brent watched them curiously. It seemed to him that Krevin was asking Tansley's advice, and that Tansley was dissuading Krevin from adopting some particular course. They conversed for some minutes, while the magistrates were examining the memorandum book and the papers. Simon Crood joined in and seemed to agree with Tansley. But suddenly Krevin turned away from both with a decisive gesture and advanced to the front of the dock. "Your Worships," he exclaimed in a loud, compelling tone, "I have had quite enough of this farce. I desire to make a full and important statement." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of In the Mayor's Parlour. Behind the panel. Despite the admonitions of the presiding magistrate and the stern voices of sundry officials posted here and there about the court, a hubbub of excited comment and murmur broke out on Krevin Crood's dramatic announcement. Nor was the excitement confined to the public benches and galleries. Round the solicitors' table there was a putting together of heads and an exchange of whisperings. On the bench itself, crowded to its full extent, some of the magistrates so far forgot their judicial position as to bend towards each other with muttered words and knowing looks. Suddenly, from somewhere in the background, a strident voice made its tones heard above the commotion. "He knows! Let him tell what he knows! Let's hear all about it!" "Silence!" commanded the chairman. "If this goes on, I shall have the court cleared. Any further interruption?" He interrupted himself, glancing dubiously at Krevin. "I think you would be well advised—" "I want no advice," retorted Krevin. Simon had been at his elbow, anxious and pleading for the last minute. He, it was very evident, was sorely concerned by Krevin's determination to speak. "I claim my right to have my say at this stage, and I shall have it. All this has gone on long enough, and I don't propose to have it go on any longer. I had nothing to do with the murder of Wallingford, but I know who had, and I'm not going to keep the knowledge to myself now that things have come to this pass. You'd better listen to a plain and straightforward tale, instead of to bits of story here and bits of story there." The chairman turned to those of his brother magistrates who were sitting nearest to him, and after a whispered consultation with them and with the clerk, nodded, not over graciously, at the defiant figure in the dock. "We will hear your statement," he said. "You had better go into the witness box and make it on oath." Krevin moved across to the witness box with alacrity, and went through the usual formalities as only a practised hand could. He smiled cynically as he folded his fingers together on the ledge of the box and faced the excited listeners. "As there's no one to ask me any questions, at this stage anyway, I'd better tell my story in my own fashion," he said. "And to save time and needless explanations, let me begin by saying that, as far as it went, all the evidence your worships have heard, from the police, from Louisa Speck, from Dr. Pellery, from Spizey and his wife, from everybody, I think, is substantially correct. Entirely correct, I might say, for I don't remember anything that I could contradict. The whole thing is, what does it lead up to? In the opinion of the police, to identifying me with the actual murder of John Wallingford, and my brother there with being accessory to the crime. The police, as usual, are absolutely and entirely at fault. I did not kill Wallingford, and accordingly my brother could not be an accessory to what I did not do, and never had the remotest intention of doing. Now you shall hear how circumstantial evidence brought to a certain point is of no value whatever if it can't be carried past that point. Hawthwaite has got his evidence to a certain point, and now he's up against a blank wall. He doesn't know what lies behind that blank wall. I do, and I'm the only person in this world who does. Now, listen to a plain, truthful, unvarnished account of the real facts. On the evening of the day before Wallingford's murder, I was in the big saloon at Bull's Snug between 6:30 and 7 o'clock. Mallett came in, evidently in search of somebody. It turned out that I was the person he was looking for. He came up to me and told me that his wife was away and that he was giving a little dinner party to my brother Simon and to Coppinger. They were already at his house, and he and they were anxious that I should join them. Now, I knew quite enough of my brother Simon, and of Coppinger, and of Mallett himself, to know if they wanted my company it was with some ulterior motive, and being a straightforward man, I said so there and then. Mallett admitted it. They had, he said, a matter of business to propose to me. I had no objection, and I went with him. What the girl, Louisa Speck, has told you about what happened after I entered the bank house is quite correct. She's a reliable and a good witness, and gave her evidence most intelligently. She took me up to Mallett's dressing room, showed me where I could get what I wanted, and left me to make my toilet. I helped myself to clean linen, and I have no doubt whatever that the handkerchief which I took from one of the drawers which the girl had opened for me was that of Dr. Wellesley's, of which we have heard so much in this case. I say I have no doubt whatever about that. In fact, I am sure of it. Having made my toilet, I went downstairs and joined my host and his other guests. We had a glass or two of Mallett's excellent sherry, and in due course we dined very well indeed. When dinner was over, Mallett got up some of his old port, and we settled down to our business talk. I very quickly discovered why I had been brought into it. What we may call the war between Wallingford as leader of the Reform Party and the town trustees as representatives of the old system had come to a definite stage, and Mallett, Coppinger, and my brother Simon realized that it was high time they opened negotiations with the enemy. They wanted, in short, to come to terms, and they were anxious that I, as a lawyer, as a man thoroughly acquainted with the affairs of the borough, and as a former official of high standing, should act as intermediary, or ambassador, or go-between, whatever you like to call it, in the matter at issue between them and Wallingford. Of course I was willing. Mallett acted as chief spokesman in putting matters plainly before me. He said that Wallingford, since his election as Mayor of Hathelsborough, had found out a great deal more than they wished him to know. He had accumulated facts, figures, statistics. He had contrived to possess himself of a vast amount of information, and he was steadily and persistently accumulating more. There was no doubt whatever, said Mallett, as to what were the intentions of Wallingford and his party, though up to then Wallingford's party did not know all that Wallingford knew. There was to be a clean sweep of everything that existed under the Town Trustees system. The Town Trustees themselves were to go. All pensions were to be done away with. All secret payments and transactions were to be unearthed and prohibited for the future. The entire financial business of the town was to be placed in the care of the Corporation. In short, everything was to be turned upside down and the good old days to cease. That was what was to happen if Wallingford went triumphantly on his way. But it was the belief of Mallett and of Coppinger and of my brother Simon that Wallingford's way could be barred. How? Well, all three believed that Wallingford could be bought off. They believed that Wallingford had his price, that he could be got at, that he could be squared. All three of them are men who believe that every man has his price. I believe that myself, and I'm not ashamed of voicing my belief. Every man can be bought, if you can only agree on a price with him. Now, the Town Trustees knew that Wallingford had ambitions. They knew what some of his ambitions were, and of one in particular. They proposed to buy him in that way, and they commissioned me to see him privately and to offer him certain terms. The terms were these. If Wallingford would drop his investigations and remain quiet for the remaining period of his mayoralty, the Town Trustees would agree to the making and carrying out of certain minor reforms, which should be engineered by and credited to Wallingford, in order to save his face with his party. Moreover, they would guarantee to Wallingford a big increase in his practice as a solicitor, and they would promise him their united support when a vacancy arose in the parliamentary representation of Hathelsborough, which vacancy, they knew, would occur within the year, as the sitting member had intimated his intention of resigning. Now, this last was the big card that I was to play. We all knew that Wallingford was extremely desirous of parliamentary honours, and that he was very well aware that with the Town Trustees on his side he would win handsomely whoever was brought against him. I was to play that card for all it was worth. So then, the proposal was, Wallingford was to draw off his forces, and he was to be rewarded, as I have said. Not a man of us doubted that he would be tempted by the bait and would swallow it. Brent leaped to his feet and flung a scornful exclamation across the court. "Then not a man of you knew him!" he cried. "He'd have flung your bribe back into the dirty hands that offered it." But Krevin Crood smiled more cynically than ever. "That's all you know, young man," he retorted. "You'll know more when you're my age. Well," he continued, turning his back on Brent and again facing the bench, "that was the situation. I was to act as ambassador, and if I succeeded in my embassy I was to be well paid for my labour." "By the Town Trustees?" inquired the chairman. "By the Town Trustees, certainly," replied Krevin. "Who else? As my principals—" "I think you will have to tell us what fee or payment you were to have," interrupted the chairman. "If—" "Oh, as the whole thing's come to nothing, I don't mind telling that," said Krevin. "I shall never get it now, so why not talk of it? I was to have £1,000. As a reward for inducing the Mayor to withhold from the public certain information which he had acquired as regards the unsatisfactory condition of the borough finances?" asked the chairman. "Yes, if you put it that way," assented Krevin. "You might put it another way, as regards the Mayor. He was to just let things slide." "Go on, if you please," said the chairman dryly. "We understand." "Well," continued Krevin cheerfully, "we settled my mission over Mallett's Port. The next thing was for me to carry it out. It was necessary to do this immediately. We knew that Wallingford had carried his investigations to such an advanced stage that he might make the results public at any moment. Now, I did not want anyone to know of my meeting with him. I wanted it to be absolutely secret. But I knew how to bring that about. Wallingford spent nearly every evening alone in the Mayor's Parlour. I knew how to reach the Mayor's Parlour unobserved. The secret of which Dr. Pellery has just told you was also known to me. I discovered the passage between St. Lawrence Tower and the Moot Hall many years ago, and I determined to get at Wallingford by way of that passage. About 7 o'clock of the evening on which Wallingford was murdered, I called at Spizey's cottage in St. Lawrence churchyard and got the keys of the church from him, on the excuse that I wanted to copy an inscription. I locked myself into the church and went up to the chamber in the tower. I spent some little time there, considering the details of my plan of campaign, before going along the secret passage. It would be about 7:30, perhaps more, when I last slipped open the panel and crossed over to the Moot Hall. The panel at the other end of the passage, which admits to the Mayor's Parlour, is the fifth one on the left-hand side of that room. I undid it very cautiously and silently. There was then no one in the parlour. All was silent. I looked through the crack of the panel. There was no one in the place at all. Incidentally, I may mention that when I thus took an observation of the parlour, I noticed that on an old oak chest, standing by the wainscoting, and immediately behind the Mayor's chair and desk, lay the rapier which was produced at the inquest and with which he undoubtedly was killed. I suddenly heard the handle of the door into the corridor turn, then Wallingford's voice. I slipped the panel back till it was nearly closed, and stood with my ear against it, listening. Wallingford was not alone. He had a woman with him, and I made out, in their first exchange of words, that he had met her in the corridor just outside the door of the Mayor's Parlour, and that they were quarrelling, and both in high temper. Stop! exclaimed the chairman, lifting his hand, as an excited murmur began to run round the court. Silence! If there is any interruption. Now, he went on, turning to Krevin, you say you heard Mr. Wallingford come back into the Mayor's Parlour, and that he was accompanied by a woman with whom he was having high words. Did you see this woman? No, I saw neither her nor Wallingford. I only heard their voices. Did you recognize her voice as that of any woman you knew? I did, unmistakably. I knew quite well who she was. Who was she, then? Krevin shook his head. For the moment, wait, he replied. Let me tell my tale in my own way. To resume, I say she and Wallingford, were having high words. I could tell, for instance, that he was in a temper which I should call furious. I overheard all that was said. He was wanting to know, as they entered the room, how she had got there. She replied that she had watched Mrs. Bunning out of her house from amongst the bushes in St. Lawrence churchyard, and had then slipped in at Bunning's back door, being absolutely determined to see him. Wallingford answered that she would get no good by waylaying him. He had found her out and was done with her. She was an impostor, an adventuress. She had come to the end of her tether. She then demanded some letters, her letters. There were excited words about this from each, and it was not easy to catch all that was said. At times they were both speaking together. But she got into a clear demand at last. Was he, or was he not, going to hand those letters over? He said no, he was not. They were going to remain in his possession as a hold over her. She was a danger to the community with her plottings and underhand ways, and he intended to show certain of those letters to others. There was more excited wrangling over this. I heard Dr. Wellesley's name mentioned, then Mallett's. I also heard some reference, which I couldn't make head or tail of, to money and documents. In the midst of all this, Wallingford suddenly told her to go. He had had enough of it, and had his work to attend to. Once more she demanded the letters. He answered with a very peremptory negative. Then I heard a sound, as of his chair being pulled up to his desk, followed by a brief silence. Then all of a sudden I heard another sound, half cry, half groan, and a sort of dull thud, as if something had fallen. A moment later, as I was wondering what had happened and what to do, I heard the door which opens into the corridor close gently, and at that I pushed back the panel and looked into the Mayor's Parlour. It seemed to Brent that every soul in that place, from the grey-haired chairman on the bench to the stolid-faced official by the witness-box, was holding his breath, and that every eye was fastened on Krevin Crood with an irresistible fascination. There was a terrible silence in the court as Krevin paused, terminated by an involuntary sigh of relief as he made signs of speaking again. And in that instant Brent saw Mrs. Elstrick, the tall, gaunt woman of whom he had heard at least one mysterious piece of news from Hawthwaite, quietly slip out of her place near the outer door and vanish. He saw, too, that no one but himself saw her go, so absorbed were all the others in what was coming. "When I saw what I did see," continued Krevin in a low, concentrated tone, "I went in. The Mayor was lying across his desk, still, quiet. I touched his shoulder and got blood on my fingers. I knew then what had happened. The woman had snatched up that rapier and run him through. I pulled out my handkerchief, the handkerchief I had taken from Mallett's drawer, wiped my hand and threw the handkerchief in the fire. Then I took up a mass of papers and a memorandum book which Wallingford had laid down, and went away by the passage. And that's the plain truth. I should never have told it if I hadn't been arrested. I care nothing at all that Wallingford was killed by this woman, not I. I shouldn't have cared if she'd gone scot-free, but if it's going to be my neck or hers, well, I prefer it to be hers, and there you are." "Once again," said the chairman, "who was this woman?" Krevin Crood might have been answering the most casual of casual questions. "Who?" he replied. "Why, Mrs. Saumarez." Chapter 25 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. The empty room. Brent was out of his seat near the door, out of the court itself, out of the Moot Hall, and in the market-place before he realised what he was doing. It was a brilliant summer day, and just then the town clocks were striking the noontide. He stood for a second staring about him as if blinded and dazed by the strong sunlight. But it was not the sunlight at all that confused him, though he stood there blinking under it, and presently his brain cleared and he turned and ran swiftly down Rivergate, the narrow street that led to the low-lying outer edge of the town. Rivergate was always quiet; just then it was deserted. And as he came to halfway down it, he saw at its foot a motor car, drawn up by the curb and evidently waiting for somebody. The somebody was Mrs. Elstrick, who was hastening towards it. In another second she had sprung in, and the car had sped away in the direction of the open country. And Brent let it go without another glance in its direction. He turned at the foot of Rivergate into Farthing Lane, the long, winding, tree-bordered alley that ran beneath the edge of the town past the outer fringe of houses, the alley wherein Hawthwaite had witnessed the nocturnal meeting between Mrs. Elstrick and Krevin Crood. Brent remembered that, as he hastened along, running between the trees on one side and the high walls of the gardens on the other. But he gave no further thought to the recollection; his brain was not yet fully recovered from the shock of Krevin Crood's last words, and it was obsessed by a single idea, that of gaining the garden entrance of the Abbey House and confronting the woman whom Krevin had formally denounced as the murderer of Wallingford. And as he hurried along he found himself saying certain words over and over again, and still again. "I'm not going to see a woman hang! I'm not going to see a woman hang! I'm not going to—" Behind this suddenly aroused quixotic sentiment he was sick with horror. He knew that what Krevin Crood had told at last was true. He knew, too, that it would never have come out if Krevin himself had not been in danger. A feeling of almost physical nausea came over him as he remembered the callous, brutal cynicism of Krevin's last words. "If it's going to be my neck or hers, I prefer it to be hers." A woman, yet a murderess, the murderess of his cousin, whose death he had vowed to avenge. But of course it was so. He saw many things now. The anxiety to get the letters, the dread of publicity expressed to Peppermore, the mystery spread over many things and actions, now this affair with Mallett. There was no reason to doubt Krevin Crood's accusation. The fragments of the puzzle had been pieced together. But as he ran along that lane, and as his mental faculties regained their normality, Brent himself did some piecing together. Every word of Krevin Crood's statement had bitten itself into his intelligence. Now he could reconstruct. It seemed to him that he visualized the Mayor's Parlour on that fateful evening, an angry, disillusioned, nerve-racked man, sore and restive under the fancy, or rather the realization of deceit, saying bitter and contemptuous words, a desperate, defeated woman, cornered like a rat, and close to her the rapier lying on the old chest where its purchaser had carelessly flung it. A maddened thing, man or woman, would snatch that up and... Blind, uncontrollable impulse, muttered Brett. She struck at him, and then it was all over. Intentional? No. Yet the law. But by God, I won't have a hand in hanging a woman. Time? He knew the exact location of the door in the garden wall of the Abbey House, and presently he ran up to it, panting from his swift dash along the lane. Not 5 minutes had elapsed then since his slip out of the excited court, but every second of the coming minutes was precious, and the door was locked. The garden wall was 8 feet high, and so built that on all the expanse of his smooth surface there was no foothold, no projection for fingers to cling to. But Brent was in that frame of mind which makes light of obstacles. He drew back into the lane, ran, gathered himself for an upward spring at the coping of the wall, leapt, grasped it, struggled, drew up his weight with a mighty effort, threw a leg over, and dropped, gasping and panting, into the shaded garden. It was quiet there, peaceful as a glade set deep in the heart of a silent wood. He lay for a few seconds where he had dropped. Then, with a great effort to get his breath, he rose and went quickly up the laurelled walks to the house. A moment more, and he was abreast of the kitchen and its open door, and in the presence of print-gowned, white-aproned women who first exclaimed and then stared at the sudden sight of him. "Mrs. Saumarez?" said Brent, frightened at the sound of his own voice. "In?" The cook, a fat, comfortable woman, turned on him from a clear fire. "The mistress has not come in yet, sir," she said. "She went out very early this morning on her bicycle, and we haven't seen her since. I expect she'll be back for lunch." Brent glanced at the open window of the room in which he had first encountered Mrs. Saumarez, and to which he had brought her the casket and its contents. "Can I go in there and sit down?" he asked. "I want to see Mrs. Saumarez." "Certainly, sir," answered cook and parlour-maid in chorus. "She can't be long, surely?" Brent went further along and stepped into the room. Not long! He knew very well that that room would never see its late occupant again. She was gone, of course. The room looked much the same as when he had last seen it, except that now there were great masses of summer flowers on all sides. He glanced round, and his observant eye was quick to notice a fact. Beneath the writing-table a big waste-paper basket was filled to its edges with torn-up papers. He moved nearer, speculating on what it was that had been destroyed, and suddenly, behind the basket, he noticed, flung away, crumpled on the floor, the buff envelope of a telegram. Brent, picking this up, expected to find it empty, but the message was inside. He drew out and smoothed the flimsy sheet and read its contents. They were comprised in 5 words: Lingmore Crossroads, 6:30. Of course that was from Mallett. He glanced at the postmarks. The telegram had been sent from Clothford at 7 o'clock the previous evening, and received at Hathelsborough before 8. It was an appointment, without doubt. Brent knew Lingmore Crossroads. He had been there on a pleasure jaunt with Queenie. It was a point on a main road whence you could go north or south east or west with great facility, and doubtless Mrs. Saumarez, arriving there early in the morning, would find Mallett and a swift motor awaiting her. Well? A sudden ringing at the front door bell, a sudden loud knocking on the same door, made Brent crush envelope and telegram in his hand and thrust the crumpled ball of paper into his pocket. A second later he heard voices at the door, heavy steps in the hall, Hawthwaite's voice. "No," said the parlour-maid, evidently answering some question, "but Mr. Brent's in the study. The mistress—" Hawthwaite, with one of his plain-clothes men, came striding in, saw Brent and closed the door, shutting out the parlour-maid. "Gone?" he asked sharply. "They say out for a bicycle ride," answered Brent, purposely affecting unconcern. "Went out very early this morning." "What did you come here for?" demanded Hawthwaite. "To ask her personally if what Krevin Crood said is true," replied Brent. Hawthwaite laughed. "Do you think she'd have admitted it, Mr. Brent?" he said. "I don't." "I think she would," answered Brent. "But—" "Well?" inquired Hawthwaite. "I don't suppose I shall ever have the chance of putting such a question to her," added Brent. "She's off." Hawthwaite looked round. He remarked. "Well, it only means another hue and cry. She and Mallett, of course. There's one thing in our favour. She doesn't know that Krevin Crood knew anything about it." "Are you sure of that?" suggested Brent. "Oh, sure enough!" affirmed Hawthwaite. "She hasn't an idea that anybody knows. So we shall get her." "What about Krevin Crood and Simon?" asked Brent. "Adjourned," replied Hawthwaite. "There's no doubt Krevin's told the true story at last, but he and Simon are still in custody and will be until perhaps to morrow. We want to know a bit more yet. But I'll tell you what, Mr. Brent, this morning's work has broken up the old system. The Town Trustees and the ancient regime, as they call it, gone. Smashed, Mr. Brent." "What are you going to do about this?" interrupted Brent, glancing round the room. "Set the wires to work," answered Hawthwaite, half carelessly. "Unless she and Mallett have laid their plans with extraordinary cleverness, they can't get out of the country. A noticeable pair, too. Went out very early this morning cycling, did she? I must have a talk to the servants. And that companion, now, Mrs. Elstrick. Where's she got to? I noticed her in court." "Left, sir, just before Krevin Crood finished," said Hawthwaite's companion. "I saw her slip out." "Aye, well," observed Hawthwaite, "I don't know that that matters. If any of them can get through the meshes of our net— Mr. Brent." "Well?" asked Brent. "We've got at the truth at last about your cousin," continued Hawthwaite, with a significant look. "It's been a case of one thing leading to another. And two things running side by side. If we hadn't cornered Krevin Crood, we'd never have had his revelations about the Town Trustees. Talk about your Local Government Board inquiry! Why, 5 minutes of Krevin's tongue work did more than half a dozen inquiries. I tell you, sir, the old system's dead. The Crood gang was smashed to pieces in that court this morning. Somehow, it's that interests me most, Mr. Brent. But business!" He turned to the plain-clothes man and nodded towards the door. "Fetch those servants in here," he said. "They've got to know." Brent went away again, carrying certain secrets with him. He put them away in a mental vault and sealed them down. Let Hawthwaite do his own work; he would give him no help. He foresaw his own future work. Wallingford, dead though he was, had won his victory, and in his death had slain the old wicked system. Now there was building and reconstruction to be done, and it was his job to do it. He saw far ahead as he trod the sunlit streets of the old town. He would marry Queenie, and they would settle into the slow-moving life of Hathelsborough, and he and the men who thought with him would slowly build up a new and healthy state of things on the ruins of the old. So thinking, he turned mechanically towards Mrs. Appleyard's house in search of Queenie. Queenie, said Mrs. Appleyard, was in the garden behind. Brent went through the house and out into the garden shade. There he found Queenie. She sat in a summer house, and she was shelling peas for dinner. The End. End of Chapter 25. Recording by Nicholas Clifford, Middlebury, Vermont, USA. End of The Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher.